Hello. Hi. How is everyone doing tonight? Good to talk with you. What's new? How are folks doing? It's a lovely evening. The sun is setting here in Brooklyn. I've got my window open, so forgive me if you hear the sound of loud cars that need a muffler or motorcycles. Unfortunately, there are some people in my neighborhood who've been entertaining themselves amid the pandemic by driving very, very, very fast. So if that's the case, you hear a brrr, some kind of loudness, don't give it any mind. But I'm glad you're all here. Got a great conversation we're going to have tonight. Got some things planned. I know you all probably have things you want me to talk about. I'll be keeping my eye on the chat. So why don't we get going? Congratulations to Isaiah. He just got his copy of City Builders and Vandals. I hope you like it. Hope you enjoy the book. It is my masterpiece. Check it out if you can get a copy. I think if you're ready to move on ahead, read "Let Them Tremble" by Tony Pensanovsky about the CPUSA after the 50s. I would love to read that book. I haven't read it. I've seen reviews of it, but I would like to get my hands on that book. It sounds fascinating. I know about some of the stuff the Communist Party did during the 1970s with Angela Davis. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's a time period in the Communist Party USA's history I don't know much about. So I definitely want to read that. So thank you for that super chat recommendation. I do appreciate it. And I'll be looking to get my hands on a copy of that book as soon as I can. I think it's available on Amazon, if I'm not mistaken. If it isn't, then I should try to get a copy another way. There was a book the Communist Party put out a few years back called "Can Capitalism Last?" and it wasn't available on Amazon, so I actually had to go to their office to get a copy of it because I wanted to read it. Right? It was by Daniel Rubin, who was one of their big thinkers. And he put this book out, and I mean, I'm still not a member of the Communist Party, and I can't be a member of any political organization. Back then, I was a member of another group, but I still wanted to read the book, and I saw it advertised, but I just couldn't order it online. So I remember I made a special trip to the Communist Party USA's office in Manhattan. Luckily, they had some copies there for sale. I bought "Can Capitalism Last?" by Daniel Rubin and read it and enjoyed it. I mean, I didn't agree with everything in it. That's okay. But yeah, so I guess if you want to go hit the like button, that would be great. If you want to hit the subscribe button, if you're not already subscribed, that would be very, very important. Hit the notifications bell. Just crush that notifications bell because we know that a lot of you are here simply for the reason that you get a notification. If people don't get notifications, they don't know these lives are happening. Um, so if that's the case, be sure to hit the notifications bell so you know that these lives are happening. You are tuned in to what we're doing here. Um, and I guess with no further ado, I'll just jump right into things. Now, I don't know if people saw, but Donald Trump has pulled the United States out of the Open Skies Treaty. The Open Skies Treaty. Now, this was a treaty, an agreement made with Russia. It was signed in 1992, around the time the Soviet Union was falling. And it allowed for a mutual aerial surveillance. Russia could fly planes over the United States could fly planes over Russia to make sure that both countries were complying with other nuclear agreements to monitor U.S. military hardware, mutual aerial surveillance. The idea for the Open Skies Treaty. Um, Last recommendation: other slavery about the genocide of slavery of natives debunks the myth that 90% of Native Americans die. Okay, I'll have to check it out. Thank you for that recommendation. I'll have to Google it. But thank you. Um, but yeah, the Open Skies Treaty. Trump has pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty. The idea for that treaty was originated by Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1955. But it really didn't get going. It didn't really get any strength until the administration of Herbert Walker Bush. It finally had some strength. So Trump is pulling out of it, and we've already had Michael Hayden, a general and former CIA director, say that pulling out of it is insanity. Because we know, I mean, it's just assumed that not only does the USA monitor the not only does the United States monitor military stuff, it's also doing all kinds of spying and intelligence work through their monitoring of the of Russia from the air. So Trump pulling out of that, it's a significant loss for the U.S. intelligence agencies. Now, Tom Cotton, the Republican congressman, he is very enthusiastic. He's been calling for withdrawal from that treaty for a long time. And what's really going on here, right? This isn't the only treaty that has been ripped up. We know Trump ripped up the Intercontinental Short-Range Nuclear Treaty, right? Trump ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, and there seems to be continued U.S. pullout of treaties with Russia and treaties with other countries, and the reason for that is simple. It's essentially because Donald Trump is tied to military manufacturers. You look at Trump's supporters; a lot of them make money through selling weapons. And there's a lot of money to be made. I mean, the United States is the world's biggest arms exporter, right? No other country in the world sells as many weapons as the United States. And Donald Trump sees that's a big moneymaker, right? That's why he was in Saudi Arabia pushing for the idea of an Arab NATO to just escalate, tensions with Iran so he can sell lots of weapons. All those Middle Eastern autocracies, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, they all buy lots of weapons from the United States. That's why there's escalation with China because Chinese enemies, the rivals of China, the countries in Asia that are aligned with the United States, they have to buy lots of U.S. weapons. That Asian pivot, right? We know about that. So that's what's going on there. But it points to a bigger divide in U.S. politics. And if you look at the Trump camp, right? If you look at the Trump camp, probably one of the most important factions is Mike Pompeo's faction, right? Now, Mike Pompeo, former CIA director, longtime CIA guy, now he's the Secretary of State. And Mike Pompeo is an evangelical Christian. He's from Kansas, I believe. Someone's out there shouting about "Go Tommy." Did you hear that? I don't even know what they're talking about. But there you go. I mean, that's the danger of having your window open, right? I guess if you really want to get on my live, find out where I live, wait till I go live and have the window open, and then shout whatever you want to shout through the window. That's your way to get publicity. So there you go. I hope Tommy goes. There you go. Is there a sporting event happening? Maybe he's like cheering for his favorite team or something. I don't know. But he just said, "Go Tommy." So there you go. Maybe he's talking to you, Tommy, for us. But yeah, there was a cartoon in The Economist a couple weeks ago, and it had Donald Trump holding a leash and Mike Pompeo as the dog. And I think that cartoon was backwards, because in a lot of ways, I think Trump is on the leash of Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo comes out of the CIA, and the CIA tend to be liberals, right? They tend to be soft power folks, but there's a certain faction in the CIA. George Herbert Walker Bush, he was CIA director for a long time. His son was also president. Gina Haspel, who's the current CIA director, who was on the record supporting torture. Mike Pompeo, they kind of represent this kind of neocon faction within the CIA. And a lot of people talk about Mormon Mafia, right? That's a phrase that's used. But the Latter-day Saints Church has a presence within the CIA as well. They tend to lean Republican. Most of the CIA tend to be Democratic Party aligned. They work with Rockefeller think tanks, which we'll talk about later. But it seems like there's a faction within the CIA that is more neocon Republican. They're definitely interventionists, but they're closer to the military-industrial complex. They're a little less soft power oriented than most of the agency. And you'll remember, like John Brennan, who was Obama's CIA director, right? He said that if Obama asked him to torture, he would resign as CIA director. He would never torture anybody. It was this big thing, right? And that the CIA, a lot of what they do is try to have PR, good PR for the United States. They want to make the United States look good around the world. They want to clean up the image of the United States. They want the United States to seem like this harmless, country that just goes around the world promoting human rights and being friendly, and they don't want to escalate confrontations. They want to manipulate with soft power and, spreading goodwill, as they say. And it's about working in the shadows. That's a lot of what the U.S. intelligence community does. So, the idea that we would be publicly torturing people, that wouldn't be fitting with what they do. But that pro-torture faction of the CIA, that particular faction, they're they're not particularly. Yeah, there you go. So, what was the ML influence over Occupy? What was the ML influence over Occupy? Um, that's a tough question. That is a tough question. Um, hmm. What is the ML influence over Occupy? Well, hmm. What was the ML influence over Occupy? The thing is, in a lot of ways, Occupy was set up for the purpose of kind of trying to push ML influence aside. Now, before Occupy Wall Street, there was something called what was it called? It was called Bloombergville. See, I moved to New York City in December of 2010. That's when I moved here. It was actually on my birthday. Well, I'm not going to say my birthday, but it was on my birthday that I moved to New York City in 2010, right? And December of 2010, I moved to New York City, and I thought I was coming for a month. And I thought I was coming for a month, and instead I ended up coming for, I've been here ever since. It's kind of cool. Came to the city on a Greyhound bus. Exciting story. But what was the ML influence in Occupy? I mean, so you have to remember that, you have to remember that, okay, how do I want to come at this? Because there's so many ways to come at this. This is kind of a big question. It's like you're asking me, I mean, this was my whole life and all of that. Yeah. So, all right. So I was in New York City, December of 2010. And, don't feed the trolls, folks. If you see something weird in the chat, just keep going. Don't feed the trolls. Nothing I can do about it. Just keep going. So, December of 2010, I moved to New York City. And so you'll have to remember that was like 2 years into the Obama administration. And yeah, it was about 2 years into the Obama administration. And wow. Yeah, so, the financial crisis was still going on. There was still a lot of unemployment in the city, in New York City. In fact, I remember the day I came to New York City, there had just been a big snowstorm in the city. And I remember that I got off the bus and someone texted me that there was a demonstration. Maybe I should close this window. There was a demonstration going on outside the MTA headquarters. And the MTA headquarters, they had a demonstration going on, and people were chanting, "Mayor Bloomberg, you should know, we want you to shovel snow." They were demanding that Bloomberg basically, hire unemployed people to start, shoveling snow in the city. And, there was like an allegation that the unions had held up the snow process. Closing the window. 1 second. And there was an allegation that the unions had been involved in covering up the snow process. And there was a lot of unemployment in the city. Bloomberg was still the mayor. So I had just gotten to the city, and the snowstorm was over, but there was like some protests going on demanding they hire unemployed people to shovel snow, basically. And I remember, I came to New York City, and so, you have to remember, as the spring started, the Arab Spring got going. And it was Tunisia, then it was Egypt, and then there was also that Wisconsin labor union thing. You remember out in Wisconsin, they were trying to pass an anti-labor law in Wisconsin that would hurt the labor unions. They were trying to pass an anti-labor law in Wisconsin, and so then, they had protests in Wisconsin. They occupied the state capitol. It was a big demonstration in Wisconsin. And so there's a lot of labor solidarity going on with that. So about the time that summer started, right, around, I think, maybe May or June, in New York City, they were cutting public spending quite a bit. They were closing public schools in New York City. They closed a couple fire departments, and they were doing that, and so there were some protests, and there was this protest called Bloombergville, where people, they slept in Lower Manhattan, and it wasn't like Occupy. They didn't seize a city block, right? They seized what you might call like a corner, I guess. And they had sleeping bags and tents there. And it was like a little protest. And that there were a lot of communists that were part of it. The group I was with was part of it. The ISO, the International Socialist Organization, they were very well represented there. There was a Trotskyite kind of coalition group called Solidarity. They were part of it. There were a lot of anarchists that were part of it, something called Organization for Free Society, which is kind of like an anarchist group. And the teachers' unions were well represented. A lot of teachers who were leftists and were union members were there. And they occupied, the corner of this street. And it got almost no publicity, almost none. And they called it Bloombergville. It was to protest Bloomberg's budget. And they did all kinds of stuff. They had little sketches and stuff. It was organized. The group that organized it was like a coalition. It was like something against austerity. New York Coalition Against Austerity, or New Yorkers Against Austerity, something like that. Or New York Students Against Budget Cuts, something like that. That was the protest. And, they would sleep there at night. I slept there a couple nights, actually. I was working at an insurance firm, so I couldn't like live there like some people did. But I slept there a few nights, and I talked to people, and there was a lot of infighting between the communist groups. Yeah, I mean, Socialist Alternative was there, and it was just kind of this collection of New York City activists, and it was the ones who were in the education unions. All right, we'll talk about that, Dimitrov. Let me finish this point because I'm trying to give you a long answer. You know, but anyhow, what was it? The the different communist groups were fighting each other, and they were anarchists and all of that. And it went on for a while. Um, went on for a while, and it was just, I mean, it was this demonstration that went on for a while. They slept there. It was like an occupation. It was kind of modeled on the square occupations in Europe. The last day there were some people that got arrested. They like occupied a bank, and the teachers unions brought out big crowds of people, and there was kind of some scuffles. And some people got arrested. And Yeah, I mean, that was that, and it was not anywhere near as big as Occupy. And I guess the Occupy stuff, August 2nd was the day that there had been that was the debt ceiling. I don't know if folks remember this, but the Republicans had shut down the government, and if the government didn't come back on, if they didn't reach an agreement about cuts in public spending by a certain day, there was going to be a debt ceiling. They called it a debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling would then, what do you call it? I don't know. The debt ceiling, it was, and the USA ended up like, its credit rating went up, and it was like an embarrassment for the Obama administration. So there was a rally called by New Yorkers Against Budget Cuts, I, at the Bull, on Wall Street, right at the corner of like Wall Street and Water Street, in Lower Manhattan. There's this giant statue of a bull. I'm sure people have seen pictures of it. So there was a demonstration called there, and there was like a permit, and a sound system was set up and all of that. And it was called by New Yorkers Against Budget Cuts. And I spoke at that rally. I had long hair then, and I actually gave a speech. You can find it on YouTube, and it's been used in a few documentaries. It was used in the documentary called Owned and Operated. It was used in another documentary about Occupy. I gave a speech at that rally called Class Against Class, where I bellowed into the microphone with my long hair and my beard, Class Against Class, and I got the crowd chanting Class Against Class. And it was, we did that. And so I guess August 2nd, that day that we had that kind of rally at the Bull, right? All of a sudden, a lot of people from Eastern Europe with Eastern European accents showed up at that rally. And they were accompanied by David Graeber, who was this anarchist, who's like a big, what is David Graeber? I mean, he was kind of the thinker behind the anti-globalization protests of the 1990s. so he showed up, and they started trying to not have a rally. They wanted people to sit in a circle and do the General Assembly thing that Occupy does with the twinkle fingers and down twinkle fingers, and they wanted people to sit in a circle. And yeah, there was kind of frustration because they were asking the media to leave and all of that. And that was, I guess, that day, August 2nd, was the first General Assembly of Occupy Wall Street. And I mean, it started out as a rally by New Yorkers against budget cuts that included the ISO and the Workers' World Party and a few other groups. And then it kind of turned into this General Assembly. Did you chat any of the Chinese Political Consultative Conference? Nope. I don't know anything about that. I don't know what that is. But yeah, and it just kind of turned into a circle, and it was they called it the first General Assembly of Occupy Wall Street. So then they started having little like general assemblies around the city, and Adbusters magazine had put out the call for Occupy Wall Street to happen. So then, they had a General Assembly in Tompkins Square Park, and they had a General Assembly in another park, and I would go to these General Assemblies with other people from the political group I was part of, and we would participate in the democracy and the down twinkles and, the whatever, and the mic check, right, where it was like someone says, because there's no microphone, it's the people's mic. It's like, I just want everyone to know, and then the crowd goes, I want everyone to know. It's this idea that, it's like the people all echo the person, right? And we were going to the General Assembly meetings for a while, but we were very frustrated. We were very, very frustrated. The political group I was in, we didn't like the politics of the General Assemblies. We were unsatisfied. And so we decided we would go. September 17th was the day Occupy Wall Street started. It was a Saturday. So we decided to go. And I remember, there's this really long escalator. Bowling Green Plaza is the train stop near there on Wall Street. There's this really, really long escalator. So we arrive at Bowling Green Plaza, and I remember I got into the escalator, was carrying some signs and literature or whatever, and we got, into the escalator, and it's this really, really long escalator. And we're wondering what the hell is going to be up at the top there, because when we got there, it was pretty nice, actually. What was there? It was a decent crowd of people, a few hundred people, a lot of them students from Oberlin College, and they had kind of Rachel Maddow-y liberal signs, right? Money out of politics, where's my bailout, student debt is bad, stuff like that. And then, that was pretty neat. So I was kind of relieved. I was worried it might turn into like an anti-immigrant demonstration or something, but it was pretty cool. So then I had someplace to go. I had to go uptown. I was there for a couple hours, passing out leaflets and stuff. And then I went uptown, and then I came back later that afternoon, and it was way bigger, way bigger, way bigger. It was huge when I got back, and they had moved to Zuccotti Park. They'd moved up from the Bull area up to Zuccotti Park. And they were in Zuccotti Park, and what I remember was weird was that Democratic Socialists of America, right, the DSA, right, they were there. They had this banner that said Democratic Socialists of America, but they were wearing like bandanas over their faces, and they were circling the park with this banner that said Democratic Socialists of America, and they looked like anarchists or Black Bloc or something, because they all had their faces covered, and they're marching with this banner, and I thought, Democratic Socialists of America, since when are they, Black Bloc? They almost looked like anarchists or radicals, and they're like circling the park over and over again. I remember the group I was with, we had this big placard that said, a job is a right, capitalism doesn't work. And that was included in a lot of the early videos of Occupy on the first week, because we brought it there and it said our name and all of that, and that was a cool thing to do. I spent a lot of time in the park. I was working full time at an insurance firm, but luckily there were a lot of holidays. The insurance firm I worked at, we got Jewish holidays off. The Sukkot, I think it's pronounced Sukkot or Sukkot, or I don't want to say it wrong, but there's a Jewish holiday. It's like the autumn festival, where you get like 3 days off and then another 3 days off, and it was great. So because they had the days off, I could go down and be at Occupy all those days. and I would go there after work, and I was really, yeah, I was around there, and I was just known as the guy that would pass out the communist newspapers and have literature tables, and then after the park was raided, at that point, the gatherings were a lot smaller after they cleared the park, but I was much more active. I was able to be at just everything. I went to everything, and they had the 1 year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. That was a crazy demonstration where a lot of people got arrested, and that was wild. That was a wild demonstration. I don't want to give my account of it. I'll get something wrong. I was there. When you're in the middle of these things, you don't stop to like read every detail. You're in the middle of it. It was a wild demonstration. A lot of arrests happened that day. I remember there was confetti everywhere, and it was pretty wild. It was like, they were going to try and stop the bell. There was like 2 days after they cleared the park, there was like a demonstration. Yeah, it was pretty wild. And it was, I mean, yeah, I mean, communist groups were there at Occupy Wall Street for sure. I mean, every communist group in the world went down there to try to sell their newspaper, or, but it wasn't a communist controlled demonstration. If anything, it was controlled more by, there were a lot of like liberal foundations that were there. There were a lot of people who it seemed like were being paid to be there almost. They had some job at some kind of democratic think tank or foundation, and they would go down there and look like they were other occupiers, but they were sleeping in some fancy hotel, and they were just there to give TV interviews and be part of it. And I remember like MoveOn.org kind of people would just show up with big boxes of old books, liberal books by Al Franken, and just distribute them and hand them out. A lot of homeless people came there because you could get food. And there's also a layer of people. I talked about this in another live. There's a layer of people that are like lumpen. You can call them the lumpen elements, right? That are, they're the people that ride the railroads for a living. The people that maybe they follow around the Grateful Dead, or, they just kind of, they don't really do much. They're not deeply political, but it's like the lifestyle anarchism or something. It's like they use drugs, and they go around, and I don't know. They're kind of voluntarily homeless. They talk about the voluntary poor in history. There was a lot of those kind of folks there. I don't know what you want to call those people, and some of them are more political than others. And there was also a whole lot at Occupy Wall Street. A whole lot of the mysticism, right? Like paganism, Buddhism, yoga, meditation, stuff like that. There was a lot of just hippie kind of stuff. I mean, you felt like you were at Woodstock. A lot of times you felt like this was some kind of weird, Woodstock reenactment or something. Yeah, I guess that's all I can say about that. Sorry it took me so long. I was just trying to, at some point I might write something about Occupy or something like that. I was working, before I started working on the book I'm working on now, I had this other project, which I'm going to get back to, but yeah, I hope that was a good answer to your question. But what else do people want to talk about? I was asked about Georgy Dimitrov. Georgy Dimitrov, he wrote this book about the United Front Against Fascism. It wasn't a book, it was a speech he gave to the Seventh World Congress of the Communist International in 1935. Yeah, it was great. It was a very, very, very great speech in which he talks about capitalism moving toward fascism out of necessity, and that communists can be at the center of an anti-fascist popular front. Great stuff. Great stuff. Yeah. What else is on people's minds? What else is on people's minds? Yeah. What's new? What is new? What's new, folks? I was talking about the Trump coalition before, right? And I've talked a lot about Betsy DeVos. She's the Secretary of Education for Donald Trump, and she's the DeVos Foundation, which was one of the main funders of the Trump movement, of like things like PragerU, things like what else? PragerU and Turning Points USA, and yeah. But there's, when a lot of people talk about the Koch brothers endlessly. There's this endless obsession on the left, I should say, with the Koch brothers. I shouldn't say the far left, but like the Maddow crowd. And among the Trump coalition, there's, you've got like some foreign policy special interest groups, and that's one thing I've noticed, right? It's like, you know, this one guy who's on the White House Trade Council is a guy named Peter Navarro. Go to sleep super early today, but when you tell me about Eritrea, are they good or bad? Thoughts about Bordago? I don't know about Bordago. I can't comment on that. But Eritrea, I can tell you about. So Ethiopia, right? There was the Kingdom of Ethiopia, which was headed by Haile Selassie. He was the emperor of Ethiopia. It was the Christian, independent Christian country on the African continent. And then we remember that it was invaded by fascist Italy in 1935. The fascist Italians invaded Ethiopia. Communists all over the world had rallies, hands off Ethiopia, but the rest of the world kind of let the Italian fascists invade Ethiopia. But, Haile Selassie, he worked with communists in Ethiopia, and he worked with the Western capitalist countries to drive the Italians out. He was on the U.S. side. He lived in exile in London for most of the war, but he was fighting against fascism. After the Second World War, he was back on the throne, and he was the dictator. I mean, he was like the dictator of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. And he's the guy, it's kind of weird. He's worshipped by Rastafarians. Like the Rastafarian religion is this religion from Jamaica that a lot of reggae folks are into. They actually worship. What's his name? So there you go. Haile Selassie, which is kind of amusing. But yeah, there's that. So Haile Selassie was running Ethiopia. Eritrea was at that point part of Ethiopia. Somalia was at that point part of Ethiopia. And it was the Horn of Africa, they call it. So, right, Eritrea had been fighting for its independence. The Eritreans felt they were an independent nation. They're Muslim, whereas Ethiopia is a Christian country. They're an Islamic people. They were fighting for their independence, and Eritrea was fighting for its independence from Ethiopia. And the Soviet Union and China were backing them and giving them armed support, and so was Cuba in fighting for their independence against Haile Selassie. But then in 1978, the central, the Ethiopian government was overthrown. There was a military coup, and a pro-Soviet military faction in Ethiopia took power, the Derg. They called it the Derg. It's like the word meant council. It was like the military council, the Derg. And the Derg, the Derg that took power, it was headed by Mengistu, and the Derg was pro-Soviet, and the Derg was very close to Cuba and started working with Cuba. The Workers' World Party actually had a very strong relationship with the Derg. Like Deirdre Griswold, who was a leader of Workers' World Party, went to Ethiopia, and actually Nelson Peary, a writer that I like a lot, he also was very supportive of the Derg. He went there, and so Mengistu and the Derg were running Ethiopia. So at that point, there was a divide within the Eritrean resistance, right? Eritrea, the question was, do they want to continue waging a civil war against the Derg, or do they want to remain part of Ethiopia and just be granted regional autonomy? And the idea was the Derg would grant them like regional autonomies. They'd be an autonomous region within Ethiopia, or did they want to fight for independence? So a lot of the Eritreans at that point wanted to support the Derg because it was pro-Soviet. But then on the other hand, there were a lot of them that didn't want to support the Derg. So the ones, communists and Bothits, okay, I'll talk about that. So the ones that didn't want to support the Derg, right? They stopped getting support from the Soviet Union. They stopped getting support from Cuba. But they continued getting support from China. And they started getting support from the CIA also. The CIA didn't like the Derg, so it liked the Eritreans. So Eritrea fought a civil war for its independence against Ethiopia when Ethiopia had a pro-Soviet government. And there was a big divide among black nationalists in the United States. A lot of black nationalists supported Eritrea because it was Muslim, and so there was a big divide. And a lot of them said it was, Soviet social imperialism. The Derg is a colonizer for the Soviet Union. It's keeping the people of Eritrea in chains. China was for Eritrea. The Soviet Union was for Ethiopia. But then it gets even weirder, because then in the 90s, the Derg was overthrown, right? The party that currently runs Ethiopia now started out as an Hoxhaist party, as supporters of Enver Hoxha. They were like an Albania communist party. They took power, and now they're not communists at all. They're just whatever. They're just a mainstream, capitalist party. They started out as an Enver Hoxha supporting party. They took power, so the Derg was thrown out. But in Eritrea, the party that's in power is that Maoist party, right, is that party that was fighting against the Derg in the name of Maoism. So the government of Eritrea is at this point pro-Chinese and I believe friendly to Russia at this point too. But yeah, I mean, Eritrea came into existence as a result of a what you could call like a proxy war, right? Where there was a lot of division, and the USA does not like Eritrea. The USA likes the government of Ethiopia, even though the government of Ethiopia tortures people, mind you. The current government of Ethiopia tortures people. It does horrendous things, horrendous human rights record, but, you know, the U.S. government loves it. Postmodernism, okay. You know, the U.S. government loves it. Um, meanwhile, meanwhile, the, what do you call it? You know, the government of Eritrea that the United States originally supported against the government of Ethiopia, the U.S. government does not like. And I've seen a lot of people refer to the government of Eritrea. They say it's like the U.S. government calls it like the North Korea of Africa. You know, and they're viewed as an anti-imperialist, communist group. They're Muslim, though. I mean, it's an Islamic country. So, I mean, and there's a lot of things that go around, but yeah, that's the situation there. And I hope that explains it. I hope that answers the question. Eritrea is an anti-imperialist country. It's a very, very poor country. I mean, very, very low level of development, but it would like to, you know, like to trade more. It's friendly to China, friendly to Russia. I don't know if you could fully call it socialist yet. You know, but it's definitely an anti-imperialist country. It's led by forces that originally were Maoists, I guess. So, yeah. Can you talk about Cuba's economic relations with the USSR and its focus, maybe over-focus on sugar production? Sure. All right. I can talk about that. Cuba, USSR relations. Okay. Okay, so I talked about Dimitrov. All right, so the communists and the Baathists, right? So, Baathist Arab socialism started out as a breakaway from the Syrian Communist Party, right? The founder of Baathist Arab socialism was an important intellectual in Syria who was part of the Communist Party. His name was Michel Aflaq. And Michel Aflaq was a Baathist, you know, he was a Communist Party member. He was from a Christian background in Syria. But he saw the French colonizers as his enemy, which would make sense. That's who was colonizing Syria. Syria was colonized by France. So as an Arab who was a socialist and a revolutionary, he felt the French were his main enemy. He wanted to fight the French colonizers. But, you know, starting in the late 30s, the feeling among the Communist Party of France, the Communist Party of Syria, the Communist parties of a lot of the world was the main enemy was fascism, right? The main enemy was Germany and Italy. So because, you know, the colonizer was a quote-unquote democratic country, there was a feeling that maybe Syria shouldn't call for independence. And since, you know, decolonization and independence of Syria was the main motivation for Michel Aflaq, he broke away from the Communist Party because he didn't agree with not fighting the French colonizers. So he formed the Baath Party. And Baath means resurrection or rebirth, right? It's a word that means like renaissance or rebirth or resurrection. That's kind of what it means. It means like renewal. And that's, you know, the Baath Party. And it was the Baathist Arab Socialist Party. And that's what they were referred to as. And, you know, they were considered to be a leftist party. They were anti-fascist. You know, they were just not part of the Communist Party. And they studied Marx, and even, you know, even still to this day, the Baathist parties, they teach Marxism, they study Marxism. Marxism has a huge influence on Baathist Arab socialism, and they agree with parts of Marxism, they just don't agree with other parts. Baath socialism, it favors a secular government, which in the Middle East is a big deal, right? In the Middle East, they tend to have religious governments, but Baath socialism favors a secular government and the protection of religious minorities, the protection of Christians, the protection of Alawites, Sunnis and Shia getting along, etc. But it tends to have a really, really positive view of Islam. It views Islam as a representation of the Arab spirit, an Arabism of the Arab people. It views Islam as kind of this really, really important part of Arab culture that they kind of, while they have a secular government, they recognize it, right? I mean, you know, Saddam Hussein, you know, practiced Islam. And interestingly, Bashar Assad, he's an Alawite. He's an Alawite, you know, which is a Shia, you know, it's like it's a form of Shia Islam. It's very, very different from what's practiced in Iran or whatever. And they don't pray in mosques. Alawites don't pray in mosques. But, you know, Bashar Assad prays in mosques, in Sunni mosques, to make a statement about how important, Islam is to the Arab tradition, right? Even though he's an Alawite, they have prayer rooms in their homes. And there's kind of a special recognition for Islam. There is opposition to Israel. You have to remember that, communists had always opposed Israel. They'd always opposed Zionism. There's pamphlets in the 1930s, from Earl Browder writes a pamphlet against Zionism. There's, Soviet books against Zionism and stuff. But after the Second World War, the Soviet Union changed its position and started supporting Israel. Now, eventually they switched, but, there was support for Israel from the Soviet Union. Baathism was always very, very opposed to Israel and viewed, the crime against the Palestinians, was opposed to Israel's existence, said that, Israel was a racist settler colonial state, which most of the communists came to eventually agree with. But that was the position of Baath socialists from day one. But yeah, there were many instances, the communist parties had a very close relationship with the Soviet Union. And there were many instances where the Baath felt like the communist parties were more concerned about following Soviet foreign policy and weren't as focused on the needs of the Arab world in the short term, right? That was an allegation that was often leveled. That the Baath parties were they were fighting for the Arab people and Arab socialism, while the communist parties were good allies, but they were a little too in bed with the Soviet Union. The other thing is that, one thing that happens, and this happens in any country that has a revolution. I saw this in Venezuela. I saw this many places. When a country has a revolution, there usually becomes one political party that becomes kind of the revolutionary party, right? In Venezuela, it's the United Socialist Party, right? And the United Socialist Party, that was the party that Hugo Chavez created. Originally, Hugo Chavez had his own party, the Movement for the Fifth Republic. After a few years in office, when it was clear they were moving to become a socialist country, Hugo Chavez announced he was forming the United Socialist Party. And he urged all the different communist groups in Venezuela to merge into the United Socialist Party. Well, all the communists that were serious did that, right? And, after the Russian Revolution, many different communist groups in Russia, the three main ones that supported the Russian Revolution, you had the Bolsheviks, then you had the left Mensheviks, and the left Socialist Revolutionary Party. But after the Russian Revolution, everybody who was really serious about supporting the new government in the Soviet Union became a Bolshevik, right? So then, in the Arab countries, in Syria and Iraq, everybody who was really serious about supporting the new government that came into power joined the Baath Party. And there were like Marxist factions within the Baath Party and all kinds of stuff, right? So the communist parties, because they were not the Baath Party, they started to become a place for naysayers, and that's the same thing that happened in the Soviet Union, right? Everyone who was really serious, right? They may have been in another party at the time of the revolution, but after it happened, they figured, okay, I'm going to be a Bolshevik. But, you had the left Revolutionary Party, you had the left Menshevik Party. Those parties kind of became a place for naysayers and ultra-lefts. And in Venezuela, same story, right? The Communist Party had been around, so had the Homeland for All Party, and the Tupac Amaru Party. There's loads of socialist and communist groups in Venezuela. But after Chavez announced he was forming the United Socialist Party, the people that were serious tended to join the United Socialist Party. And the other parties that exist in Venezuela, which I met with, the Communist Party, some of these other groups, most of them at least support Chavez on paper, but they have kind of a naysayer attitude. They're very critical. And that's kind of what happens. And that happened in the Baath countries. That the communist parties that didn't merge into the Baath Party, the people who stayed being the Communist Party and make clear we're the Communist Party, we're not the Baath Party, those folks became kind of what you might call like permanent opposition, right? I jokingly, the Trotskyists, it's like the left opposition, permanent revolution. I jokingly call them the permanent opposition. They're just naysayer elements that just kind of, they're going to be against whoever's in power. They're those elements, right? And that happened. Now, obviously there was political repression, and I'm not endorsing any political repression. But if you were in Iraq and you were a serious socialist, revolutionary, anti-imperialist, and you wanted to get something done, are you going to join the small, isolated Communist Party, or are you going to join so Tolstoy and Modi. All right. Are you going to join the Ba'ath Party? Well, you're going to join the Ba'ath Party. But if you're somebody who's kind of angry at society, you're more of a naysayer, oppositionist, you're going to join the Communist Party. And that happened. And that happens a lot, right? And that happened in the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, that happens in revolutions, right? There are many factions involved, but it pretty clearly becomes one faction is the leading group, and then there's people that just will not join that group. They're going to be the opposition. And those folks, they become problematic, and that's kind of how these things work. I mean, if you want to have influence in a revolutionary government, you're gonna end up joining the party that is the front runner of the revolution. Why I don't understand in Venezuela, why would you not merge into the United Socialist Party? Maybe you keep a communist organization, you keep your own group, you don't dissolve your own group, but you all join the PSUV. Why would you form a separate party? It's again, but this is a different perspective, and it points to there's a lot of dogmatism on the left. Okay, so we talked about communists and Baathists and the problems of their relationship. All right, postmodernism. Postmodernism is the idea that there is no grand historical narrative, right? When you say modernism, you're talking about the modern world, modernity, right? You're talking about the 20th century. You're talking about World War One, World War Two, fascism, communism, liberal democracy. These are all modernist ideologies. And the idea is postmodernism argues that they are all wrong because they are all arguing that there is one grand narrative of humanity. And they're wrong because they push forward the notion of objective reality. The fact there is only one truth. There's not multiple interpretations. They put forward the idea there are different narratives, right? That the truth is found in competing narratives and dialogue, not in any objective measurement, that there are no grand narratives for humanity. That's postmodernism. And it blames the problems of the modern world on, it's very much anti-totalitarianism, right? It's the CIA synthetic left thing about, all grand narratives about humanity are the same. They're all problematic. Marxism, fascism, they're all the same because they're all, trying to impose things. That's postmodernism, and it kind of leads itself to this, shades of gray. The world is, is so much more complicated. There's truth on all sides. Yeah. Okay. Am I being asked about the EFF in South Africa? What's the deal with the downward trend of the U.S. and I'm sorry, what was that from EE Camp? Can someone repeat it? The EF in South Africa, the downward trend. What is it? U.S.-China relations. Okay, yeah, I was going to talk about that, but you're all coming at me with your super chats. Okay. All right, so I think I answered postmodernism. Cuba-USSR relations. Cuba-USSR relations. Well, originally Fidel Castro didn't say he was a communist. Originally he said he was an advocate of Jeffersonian democracy. The new government came in. Eventually, about 1962, he proclaims that Cuba is a socialist nation. They've already nationalized a lot of things at that point. They start getting a lot of Soviet aid. And the United States is absolutely opposed to the Cuban Revolution because it's, they hate communism in Russia, they hate communism in China, but communism on the hemisphere, the same hemisphere of the United States, oh my gosh, they're against it. Bay of Pigs invasion, etc. The USA is just trying to crush them. And the Soviet Union already has sugar. You have to keep in mind they have beets, right? The Soviet Union, they have beets. They like beets over there in Russia. And they can get sugar from those beets. They don't need Cuban sugar, but they start buying Cuban sugar in big numbers. Cuba was already, since the time of colonialism, Cuba had been a sugar plantation, a lot of sugar plantations. Well, the sugar plantations were nationalized. They start selling sugar to the Soviet Union, and not just the Soviet Union, but the communist bloc. Eastern Europe, all of that. In fact, a lot of Americans volunteered to help cut sugar cane in Cuba. The Venceremos brigades. That was one of their things. You would go and live in Cuba for a month and cut sugar cane with a machete. The Soviet Union bought that sugar way higher than they needed to. They weren't buying it at market value, number one. Number two, they didn't even really need it because they had beet sugar of their own, right? They had sugar, but they bought it. And the United States cracked down on, I mean, on sugar. Like if you import, from what I understand, if you set up a business and you were importing, any food product to the United States with sugar, any company is required to like basically sign an affidavit that there is not 1 ounce of Cuban sugar in there, and that the embargo on Cuba has been ridiculous. I mean, the amount. I mean, Cuba has huge amounts of sugar, but you can't buy sugar from. I mean, that's one thing they've tried to crush them. Now, during the Soviet years, that was their main thing, is they supplied sugar to the socialist countries of the world. That's what Cuba did. Now, Cuba's economy is, they still have a lot of sugar, but they're more oriented toward tourism. They've set up a big tourist sector, right? And a lot of people go there for vacation. There's a lot of resorts and hotels and stuff, and a lot of people from Europe go to Cuba for vacation, and that they've got tourism more than they used to. But yeah, that's yeah. I mean, there's people who want to make it out like the Soviet. I've heard this before. Like, Cuba was the Soviet Union's sugar plantation. Why did they buy it overpriced then? Right? They could have bought sugar from somewhere else way cheaper. They bought it overpriced because they were making a political statement of supporting the Cuban government. Um, you know, uh, yeah. I mean, and so that's just that narrative about the Soviet Union was colonizing Cuba or something. That's false. I know that some of the Maoists like to put that out there. There was a pamphlet, "Burned Down the Cane Fields" by the RCP, that made that argument. There were some other ones, that made that argument. I don't buy it. I really don't. And, Fidel Castro would cut sugar cane, and a lot of these American volunteers would cut sugar cane, and it was, yeah, I mean, it's something that goes on in Cuba. A lot of sugar cane is cut in Cuba. But they also built up some industries, and rum, Cuban rum, right? That's one thing. Rum and cigars from Cuba are just very, very valued. I've never had either, but they're very, very valued, and you cannot, if you bring those into the United States, you will go to jail for a long time. They will lock you up if they catch you trying to bring Cuban cigars to the United States. They catch you trying to bring Cuban rum to the United States, you will go to prison. I mean, they are really harsh about that. When I was, thinking about going to Cuba, I was going to like some classes, preparing to go to Cuba. Never ended up going, which is a whole nother story. But when I was doing that, there's one thing they emphasized. They said if you try to bring some Cuban rum with you, you will go to jail. You try to bring some Cuban cigars with you, you will go to jail. And I remember when I was at the World Festival of Youth and Students in Sochi, Russia, I actually stayed in the Cuban building. Because I was a journalist and a speaker at the conference, instead of putting me in a dorm with like other youth from around the world, they gave me my own room. But in order to have my own room, I had to be in the Cuban government building. So I was in the Cuban building, and none of them spoke English, and my Spanish isn't too good. So remember, every night I would have to show them my key, and like we'd have this like argument, in our, with neither of us speaking the right language to convince them I was actually in the building. But yeah, I had a room in the Cuban building, and that Cuban building, right, in Sochi, Russia, they had made, the rule that there, because a lot of people from the Muslim countries, a lot of people that were underage were coming to the festival, there could be no alcohol, right? All right, drugs under socialism. There could be no alcohol. So the Cubans had brought a whole bunch of Cuban rum with them and a whole bunch of Cuban cigars. And, I don't drink, I don't smoke, so I didn't partake in either. But all day, all night, I heard that salsa music, and people from all over the festival were coming to the Cuban building to get some of their Cuban rum, because there was no alcohol in Sochi that week for the festival. So that was kind of wild. And I mean, salsa music all night long. But it was kind of neat. I have pictures on Facebook. I mean, it was kind of neat to be able to stay in this like dormitory with a big picture of Che Guevara, hanging. It was pretty neat to be in the building with the Young Communist League, and I gave them copies of my writings, and it was pretty neat. And I got to hang out with the Young Communist League of Cuba. It was pretty neat. But yeah, they're really into that rum and those cigars, and they're very valuable. And Cuban cigars, I don't smoke cigars, but people tell me that, I mean, I don't know what it is about cigars that people like, but something about the Cuban cigars, they're like more intense than other kinds or something. I don't know what it is, but there's something about them. People that smoke cigars, they like them way, way more than they like other countries' cigars. So there you go. Yeah. So that's all I can say about that. Um, but yeah, the Cubans have a very good reputation for their rum, which is made from their sugar. Um, and the U.S. government really doesn't want you to have any of that rum or any of those cigars. No Cuban cigars, no Cuban rum. They don't want you to have that. So there you go. Um, yeah. All right. Leo Tolstoy, right? War and Peace, the epic novel. Very, very long novel about Napoleon's invasion of Russia, right? Leo Tolstoy is existential, right? And it's about right and wrong and, choices and do we have free will? Yeah, I haven't studied that stuff as much as I should. I know it's very, very important. At one point when I was in high school, I started trying to read War and Peace. I just never could get into it. I was too young, really. I may need to revisit that at some point. I know it's very, very important literature. It's deeply influential. And one of the things that I guess is one of the themes in War and Peace, I haven't read it, but when I've read, when people have discussed it, one thing that people who have read it have told me is that one of the themes in War and Peace is that the peasantry of Russia, which is being oppressed by the Tsar, in some cases saw Napoleon as a liberator, right? But yet they were betraying their homeland, right? Because Napoleon wanted to come colonize their homeland. And it talks about the Russian people and their particular attachment to the land and their need to defend the land and the spiritual connection the Russian people have to the land. Meanwhile, at the same time, how the peasantry, when Napoleon invaded countries, he brought bourgeois democracy. He tended to overturn feudal relations. So it was complicated. Um, you know, um, very, very complicated. So, I mean, that's what I'll say about Leo Tolstoy. Modi in India. You know, I tend to look on the bright side when people take office. When Modi took office in India, I mean, he was from the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party. He was tied to that ugly massacre of Muslims. Um, but it seemed pretty clear that he was more open to a better relationship with Russia and China, and he was not as pro-U.S. as his rivals in the Congress Party. So I was a little bit optimistic. I thought, well, maybe this will be a good thing, right? Maybe this will open the door to the BRICS more, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We're talking about having their own currency. Maybe this will advance the BRICS. Maybe this will be a good development. Yeah, I mean, Modi. I mean, he did the banking reforms in India that a lot of people, a lot of people on the right in India and on the left were also very shocked about, where he took the gold from people. But yeah, I mean, I'm not impressed with Modi. I mean, but he's independent. I will say that he's not a puppet. Modi is not a puppet. He's a bourgeois nationalist. He's like Erdogan. He's like Duterte. He's a bourgeois nationalist. He is independent, and Obama, dissed him. I mean, the Obama wing of American capitalism doesn't like him. And he was denied a visa at one point because of his tie to the anti-Islamic murders, which was in a lot of ways Obama kind of making a gesture to the Arab world, to the Muslim world, that he was on their side. So it's complicated, right? It's always complicated. But yeah, he's a far right wing figure. I mean, he's a Hindu nationalist. And every so often, they don't like his banking regulations, right? They don't like the fact that on some level he's doing some Bonapartist control of the economy. Every so often, the Wall Street Journal will denounce him for his banking regulations or some trade deal he's making. But at the end of the day, he will make a deal with Russia and China if he thinks it's better for him. He'll make a deal with the United States if he thinks it's better for him. He's not a communist, definitely not a socialist, definitely not on the left. He's on the right. He's a Hindu nationalist, but he's part of that current that is not, he's a bourgeois nationalist. He's not a puppet, right? Bolsonaro, people want to call him a nationalist. I don't know. Bolsonaro just works for the right wing in the United States, right? Janine Áñez, right, in Bolivia, right? People want to call her a nationalist. She's not a nationalist. She just works for the right wing in the United States. No, Modi's an actual nationalist. I mean, he actually, he's independent. He works for Modi. He works for the billionaire capitalists of India. And he will say no to the United States. He'll say no to Russia and China. He will just do and Duterte is like that. Erdogan is like that. They're looking to make a deal. They're looking to advance their own interests. Yeah. And we're going to see more of that. The rise of Russia and China has created this space for that, right? As Russia and China continue to rise, as the world becomes multipolar, you're going to get a layer of people, and leaders in the developing world who are going to be like that. They're going to be independent. They're not going to be socialists, right? They're not going to be anti-imperialists or revolutionaries, but they're also not going to be puppets. We're going to get actual bourgeois nationalism, and I think, we can see more of that. And I mean, to some degree, we saw a little bit of that in Brazil. That when Dilma Rousseff and Lula were in office, they weren't ready to take Brazil fully to socialism. Brazil was a social democratic government. They weren't going to change property relations, right? And they were friendly to the United States and the Bolivarian countries, and they were willing to make a deal. Now that they've been forced out of office, now they realize they need the working class, right? And so now Lula sounds like a revolutionary. You listen to Lula da Silva now; he sounds he sounds like a communist almost. But when he was a president, he was very much middle of the road. Lula da Silva was very much a middle of the road kind of guy, more of a bourgeois, social democratic bourgeois nationalist. But now Lula seems to be in a revolutionary direction. So it's complicated. These things are complicated. That's what I think of Modi. The EFF in South Africa. Well, there's divisions. South Africa, you have to remember, they were victorious. Apartheid was brought down at the time the Soviet Union was falling. Right? Originally, obviously, the plan of the African National Congress was to create a socialist society in South Africa. The Soviet Union fell, and they weren't ready to have a civil war, and so there was not much change in property relations. Civil rights were granted to the African people, but there was very little. There wasn't much nationalization and things like that. The EFF is a faction that broke away from the African National Congress, arguing that they are more socialist, more revolutionary, I guess, than the South African National Congress, than the ANC. And there's back and forth, and there's division. But it's I've talked to people from South Africa. It's more of an internal party disagreement. There are disagreements within the ANC. It's not as ideological as people might think. And there are people in the ANC that are more revolutionary than the EFF, and there are people in the EFF that are more revolutionary than the ANC, and that these are political coalitions. That's what you have to remember. South Africa is a very, very, very big country. A lot of different forces there, a lot of different coalitions. And at some point, there may come a time where there's more, land redistribution and things in South Africa. Because there's a lot of people there, a lot of working class people that are black in South Africa that don't have much, and there's still this layer of wealthy white people in South Africa. It's complicated. So that's all I'll say about that. All right, U.S.-China relations. The USA is trying to distract from the fact that it completely is bumbling this pandemic, and it's trying to scapegoat China and blame China for the pandemic. On top of that, it's trying desperately to push back against China's huge expanded credibility around the world. China's the main supplier of protective equipment. China has just pledged $2 billion to help the fight against the pandemic. China is seen as coming out of this pandemic way ahead, right? They are coming out of this as the people that alerted the world about it, that mobilized effectively to beat it before anybody else, even though they had no warning. That's China. This is a pushback. The United States is trying to push back against China because China is going to come out of this pandemic economically ahead, and everyone knows that. They got going before anyone else did. They handled it, very effectively, whereas, here in the United States, some of us are turning on, some of us aren't, and China's going to come out of this way ahead, and the United States is already prepping to push back against them. That's really what's going on there. Okay, drugs under socialism. Drugs under socialism. Well, I don't think that drug users should be treated like criminals, right? I think that a lot of people who use drugs, I think it should be treated as a mental illness. Addiction should be mental illness or, a medical problem. At the same time, I don't think drug use should be promoted. It's not a good thing. And I don't like the normalization of it. I don't like this feeling that it's just this cool thing people do. Marijuana, I've never smoked marijuana. I don't know what it's like. But people, supposedly marijuana is just as bad as alcohol. It's less dangerous. So marijuana, okay. But, heroin, no. Morphine, no. Cocaine, acid, hard drugs. You can't be tolerating that. I think the question is, do we punish people? Do we just beat down and punish people who do it? Or do we treat it like a medical problem, which it is, right? And I think that people who are addicted to drugs should be given treatment. I think they should be given compassion. I think that dealers and importers should not be given, compassion. I think that should be penalized. But, I don't know. I don't think drug use is good. I don't buy into the idea it's good. Okay, so I was asked about reunification. A lot of people that I know that are Chinese tell me it's going to happen. right? One of these days, it's going to happen, right? China China will be reunified. Right now it's one country, two systems, but Taiwan and China being under the same government, it's really only a matter of time. And it'll happen. It'll probably just eventually happen. Um, you know, I assume that China would want it to happen in a way that wouldn't result in World War III. It wouldn't be, dramatic. It wouldn't be like a big invasion or something, but it's going to happen, most likely. In the United States, it seemed for a while, um, divisions in NATO between the USA and Turkey. All right. Yeah. It seemed for a while like they were just kind of naturally coming together. The KMT and the Chinese Communist Party were getting along. But now it seems like the United States, there's a lot of elements in the United States that really are determined to prop up, um, what you might call the elements that are anti-mainland in Taiwan. So because of that, it looks like that things are going to have to come to a head. So I don't know, but I don't know what's going to happen. Okay, all right. Chinese Communist Party factions. Well, officially, there's no factions in the Chinese Communist Party. There's no like official factions, right? But you know that not everyone in an organization of 90 million people agrees, right? And that there is a huge neo-Maoist revival in China right now. There's been bookstores all over the country. There's a huge neo-Maoist revival in China right now. Plus, there's a whole lot of capitalist sentiment. There's a lot of people who just want open free market capitalism in China right now. And the party, the Chinese Communist Party, has people in it that are of both sides. There's neo-Maoist types, and there are, full-on capitalist types, right? There are some that think socialism and, is just it's just on, it just means the economy is good, but we really believe in capitalism, and Mao, they don't believe in communism. And then there are some folks that are, you can see that there's a neo-Maoist current also. So, you'll remember that Boji Lai, who was this demagogue, this ultra-leftist demagogue, in a few years ago, he was arrested, and he was suppressed. Korean reunification. He was arrested and he was suppressed, but it was pretty clear he had a big base of support within the party. And then right after his arrest, we saw the rise of Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping talked a much more Maoist and communist line than his predecessors did. And the reason for that was it seems like that was, the folks that was bringing the folks that were more loyal to Boji Lai. It was giving them representation from the top. I think that Xi Jinping is the leader of the entire party. He represents the entire party when he speaks, and his line is more or less the centrist view within the party. And I think there are people that are more free market than Xi, and I think there are people that are more hardline and communist than Xi. And I think that Xi Jinping represents what is probably like the centrist position within the party. Yeah, so there you go. But yeah, there are no organized factions. Let me be clear about that. And the United States is, there was a letter floating around, it was like anonymous Communist Party members who want to get rid of Xi. The United States is always trying to create the illusion that there's like big unrest and like drama, like House of Cards, power struggles inside the CPC and stuff. That's not true, right? For the most part, the CPC marches as one. There are different approaches. There are different approaches within the country and outside the party too. There are a lot of, there is a layer of people in China that are right wing and capitalist and love the West, and there's a layer of people in China that are ultra left. Right, there are some ultra left groups in China now too, that want to overthrow the party or whatever. There's a layer of that. There's like Trotskyite groups and stuff. So China is a country. Look how big the Chinese country is. Do you think everyone is going to agree on everything? Absolutely not. Look how big the Chinese Communist Party is. Do you think they're all going to agree? No. Now, they don't officially allow factions. Officially, they're all unified. That's democratic centralism, right? Unity in action, right? So they keep whatever disagreements they have internal, which is good, right? It's a disciplined organization. That's how they function. All right. Korean reunification. Moon Jae-in is the most friendly to the North that we've seen in a long time. You had the Sunshine Policy, the late 90s, but Moon Jae-in, that was a complete repudiation of Park. For years it was right-wing militarists running North Korea. Well, now it seems like we have a moment where Moon Jae-in, who's friendlier to the North, who favors negotiations with the North, he seems to be favoring it. We saw the joint Olympic team. Things were moving in a really, really good direction, and then it stopped. And I think, folks, give me flack for saying it, I think Donald Trump was a force for good on the Korean Peninsula, and Donald Trump was stopped. I think Donald Trump wanted to be known as the guy who, got North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons. That's what he wanted to be, for whatever reason. And I think that was, as bad as Trump is, that was one thing he was doing right for his own ego. He wanted to be the deal maker with North Korea, and things were moving in a very, very good direction. And then they stopped. And I will say that I think China is essential. When you have to remember, so in the final years of the Park administration, right? Obama and the Park administration, they unloaded these huge this weapons system, right? This what is it? It was called the THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Defense System. It was this missile system that they unloaded. It's kind of like the Iron Dome in Israel that Obama set up in South Korea. And, it not only violated North Korea's territory with its radars, it also violated the territory of Russia and China with its radars. Both Russia and China and North Korea all said, you can't build this missile system. They did it anyway. And at that point, China took dramatic economic measures against South Korea for doing that. And it hurt South Korea because China is a big factor in South Korea's economy. And it's probably the biggest factor in North Korea's economy. China is trading and doing business with both North and South Korea. Russia is doing business with both North and South Korea, as much as they can with the UN sanctions. They're doing what they're allowed to do. I mean, there are these UN sanctions, right, about because of the North Korea withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But Russia has a good relationship with North Korea. China has a good relationship with North Korea. But both of those countries have a relationship with South Korea as well. And as South Korea becomes more independent, right? South Korea is no longer a U.S. puppet country. It's not like a U.S.-backed military dictatorship anymore. We got Moon Jae-in in there. And as South Korea becomes more independent, I think that we're going to move in that direction. I don't think South Korea is ever going to adopt, well, not anytime soon. South Korea is not going to adopt socialism. I think that South Korea and North Korea will be getting closer together. They'll be having more open borders and things between each other. There'll be more traveling back and forth. But I don't think, I'm not saying that I think the South is going to adopt the North Korean system. That won't happen. And I don't think the North is going to adapt the South Korean system either. I think they're both going to maintain their way. They may grow to be similar to each other. If North Korea can have its reform and opening up, it may become more like China and less like Cuba. It may move in a more, market socialist direction. South Korea may become more social democratic, but I don't see there being like, some triumphant overthrow of one of the governments on the peninsula. I think they'll grow friendlier to each other. And I think it's going to happen because there's Russia and China now. And this is kind of the whole thing about multipolarity. There's Russia and China now to trade with. So, the reason that South Korea was always so viciously hostile to the North was because, the United States was kind of ruling over South Korea. Well, now the world is changing. Now there's a lot of U.S. troops in South Korea, and that's going to be a question. For years and years and years, there have been protests in South Korea against the presence of U.S. troops, right? Massive demonstrations and stuff like that. So, think about that. I mean, that might become an issue. Yeah. What else is on people's minds tonight? This just kind of turned into a super chat free-for-all. What else is new? I'm kind of tired, but what else is new? It's kind of that warm summer atmosphere. It's dark outside. It's no longer warm, and the sun has set outside. What else is new? What else is new? Thoughts on Ralph Nader? I met him a couple times at events. I went to a birthday party for Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, and he was there. Consumer advocate, populist, anti-corporate activist, right? That's Ralph Nader. Not a socialist, not a Marxist, but a kind of an anti-corporate populist consumer advocate. He's Lebanese, actually. That's his heritage, and he's from a Lebanese Christian family. You know, A deep voice, compelling personality. Everyone tried to blame him for the Bush administration. It was like, see, that's what happens when you have third parties. It was like this big crime. All the Democrat, it was like, oh, Ralph Nader ruined. He was the spoiler. He ruined the election. That was a big thing. I heard that for 8 years. Nothing but Ralph Nader is responsible for the Bush administration. But yeah, um, yeah, it fits in with like the Generation X activism, right? I did a video about activism in the '90s, Gen X activism, Free Mumia, Democracy Now, stuff like that. But I don't think he's running for office anymore. I mean, he's getting up there in years, and he's a personality. Uh, yeah. What else is new? What else is new, folks? And no, it's not fruit punch. It's actually pink lemonade. It's raspberry lemonade. Did Lee Kuan Yew represent financiers or an industry? Well, in Singapore, there's a few families that are like the ruling families of Singapore. Um, Lee Kuan Yew is like a Bonapartist. I mean, he comes out of the military of Singapore, and he did a lot to develop the country. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm not a communist, but he had an alliance with the forces. Temporarily, he was aligned with the folks they called pro-communists. I have his autobiography. It's kind of fascinating. Yeah, he's Lee Kuan Yew. Um, I mean, yeah, I mean it's a successful kind of example of Bonapartism, an Asian tiger country. Someone's mentioning, was he influenced by Oswald Mosley? I've heard that because I know the symbol for Lee Kuan Yew's party is that circle with the lightning bolt, which is it's Bolt Bus. First of all, that's the Bolt Bus, right? The bus company in the United States, but it's also the symbol of Lee Kuan Yew's party, I believe. I mean, he's not a communist. There are some people that argue that his economic model is more socialist. Oh, Turkey versus the USA, right? We'll talk about that. All right. But yeah, Turkey versus the USA and NATO. Um, you know, uh, right at the beginning of the Syrian war, at the very beginning of the Syrian war, you'll have to remember that Turkey was kind of essential because Turkey, right? So Erdogan is president, and Erdogan, it was a big deal when he took office because he's a Muslim, right? And that there's been a huge, Ataturk, Kemal Ataturk, right? And the modern Turkish state was created, by Turkish nationalism, Kemal Ataturk, and all this. There was a feeling that they are not going to have a religious government, that they are going to modernize, and that religious government is just not what they want. And that is kind of this attitude. The Turkish state was founded on this ideology that they were not going to have a religious government. It is a crime still in Turkey to advocate the creation of a religious government in Turkey. Um, but Erdogan took power, and he's a religious guy. He's a Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, he comes out of that milieu. And Gulen, right, who was the cleric, this Muslim cleric with ties to the CIA, and that Islam expanded in Turkish society. Like more religious Islamic views has really, really expanded in Turkey. Now, Gulen then tried to overthrow Erdogan, and that's a whole thing. But it seemed like, yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood and, rallying Muslims around the world to want to overthrow Assad, Turkey, utilizing Turkey's border with Syria to smuggle weapons in. That was a big part um, of the Syrian civil war when it started. I'm talking about the Jarablus corridor was like where a lot of the weapons for ISIS were coming from. It seemed like, and that, yeah, there was a lot of Turkish involvement in trying to overthrow Assad, and Turkey was a central part of the United States. Then that coup happened, the coup attempt. The Gulen people tried to overthrow Erdogan. All right, there was a coup attempt, and it failed. And Erdogan was victorious, and he wasn't overthrown. And at that point, it seemed like Turkey and the United States weren't getting along as well. And there now seems to be very, very big tension between Turkey and the United States, right? We know that Trump continues to beat the drum about this Christian pastor he feels Erdogan is persecuting. And it seems like Turkey is not solidly, with the United States. Now, keep in mind, the United States was arming the Kurds, right? The Kurdish forces in Syria. And Turkey considers the Kurds to be terrorists, right? It considers the Kurdish forces in Syria to be the same entity as the Kurdish separatist elements they've been waging civil war against for decades. So, because of that, there was already distrust. The fact that Obama was sending weapons and all that to the Kurds. So now it seems like Trump, you know, I mean, the relationships are weird. When Trump, took weapons away from the Kurds, that was seen as like a favor to Turkey. It's complicated. I think Turkey, again, it's like Modi, it's like Duterte. They want to do their own thing, right? They'll make a deal with Russia, they'll make a deal with the United States. Turkey is a member of NATO, right? They are a member of NATO. And they remain a member of NATO, but they're not as solidly in the U.S. camp. I mean, that coup, when that happened, when it seemed like pro-U.S. forces in the Gulen camp were trying to topple Erdogan, I think that was a big moment where that the distance between the United States and Turkey got bigger. That's all I can really say about that. What else is on people's minds? What else is new, folks? What else do you want me to talk about? I'll just sit on here and ramble all night. What are we talking about? This is a weird live. I apologize. I usually have like a prepared show, and I kind of did, but I'm tired, and things are just taking an interesting direction. So, yeah. What books do you recommend on the Korean War? Bruce Cummings wrote some great books about the Korean War. North Korea, Another Country, Korea's Place in the Sun. That stuff is really, really good. Um, yeah, I would really, really recommend that. There's also a very good book by Anna Louise Strong. It's called like In North Korea or something. It's like when North Korea was being founded in the late 40s. Anna Louise Strong, the American journalist, went to North Korea. She wrote a very good book about it. She interviewed a lot of people. That was a pretty good book. What else? Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot. What country was it where Che Guevara led an unsuccessful guerrilla warfare revolution and it was the wrong strategy? I mean, Bolivia? I mean, is that what you're talking about, Augie? I mean, yeah, Che died in Bolivia. Che Guevara died in Bolivia. He was killed by CIA and their allies in Bolivia. Um, you know, um, I mean, is that what you're getting at? I don't know if that's what you're getting at. But yeah, I mean that he was in the countryside trying to wage a guerrilla war in Bolivia, and he was not successful. But Che also fought in the Congo, right? I mean, he was not successful there either. I mean, he was successful in Cuba, and but yeah, but after his death, there was the Tricontinental, which is this international organization that was established that was trying to kind of promote guerrilla warfare and anti-imperialism, and you know, excuse me, I don't want to. Excuse me, sneezed. But yeah, that after the so okay, what were you planning to talk about tonight? I was planning to talk about like the Rockefellers and stuff like that, but yeah, we're just kind of bantering here back and forth. But yeah, so after okay, so right, there was the Sino-Soviet split, right? 1961, the Soviet Union and China cut ties. Big falling out between the Soviet Union and China. Cuba's neutral, and North Korea is neutral, but most of the socialist countries, for the most part, side with the Soviet Union, and China tries to present itself as like the center of global revolution, but then by 1969, 1970, 1972. China is aligning with the United States against the Soviet Union, saying the Soviet Union are Soviet social imperialists and the Soviet Union is the main danger to the people of the world. They have their three worlds theory. And then around the same time, around like the early 70s, late 60s, there started to be a current in Latin America. Che Guevara was already dead, but there was a current in Latin America, of people that were in the Soviet camp, I guess. They were not Maoists. They were not pro-China, but they were more radical, right? And they were pushing guerrilla warfare, and they were more radical, and they tended to be centered around Cuba and North Korea. And there was like within the Brezhnev, right? The Brezhnev years of the USSR. The USSR is supporting, more countries that are fighting for national liberation. The détente seems to be over, right? Why did China go to war with Vietnam, and why are relations still sour? I'll talk about that, China and Vietnam. Um, but at the same time, like, Brezhnev and the Soviet Union, but there was like a more radical wing within the pro-Soviet milieu, and in a lot of cases, and there were even like different parties that were formed. Like in Chile, there was the Communist Party of Chile, but there was something called the MIR, or the Movement for the Revolutionary Left. You know, in the United States, the Workers' World Party, Marxites, they were kind of that. They were pro-Soviet but more radical. And that was a current, you know, 70s and 80s. You had, you know, like the Sandinistas, you had the Derg in Ethiopia, you had North Korea. And it was like within the Soviet milieu, there were these people that were more radical than the Soviet Union. They were like third world national liberation kind of forces that were more radical. And yes, originally China had tried to be the center of those forces. But you know, but China by the early 70s was starting to support the United States. But yeah, Gaddafi was definitely a big part of that. You know, and it was just there was this anti-imperialist current, I guess you could say, that was with it. It was pro-Soviet. It wasn't with China, but it was more radical than most in the Soviet camp, right? Soviet officials were not as radical as these forces were. You know, and I mean, the African National Congress. You know, the African National Congress. Thank you, Augie. I'm happy to answer your question. No problem. The African National Congress, the ANC. Let's remember that Nelson Mandela's organization was designated as a terrorist group by the U.S. government. Let's not forget that they called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, right? At the time he was fighting for his freedom. You know, and the USA condemned the Soviets for giving weapons and support to the African National Congress in South Africa. So, you know, I mean, the USA was completely on the wrong side in the South African anti-apartheid struggle. Nelson Mandela was a tanky. Don't you forget it. Um, and there you go. All right, so China and Vietnam. Um, China and Vietnam. Okay, so it's interesting. You all seem to be very interested in like Cold War, late Cold War geopolitics. I get a lot of questions about that. I'm happy to talk about it. I just hope I don't, you know, sound like what is it, the old thing, like I sound like a broken record, you know, where you repeat yourself. But you know, whatever. So, China and Vietnam. I talk about this in my class, Mao and American Socialists. So you really ought to watch that class if you want to talk about it. But yeah, China and Vietnam. Okay, so right, the Vietnam War. We know about the Vietnam War. China and the Soviet Union are big supporters of the Vietnamese. You know, China becomes more and more critical of the Vietnamese. You know, Soviet Union becomes more supportive. The Vietnam War. Vietnam is reunified, 1975. Richard Nixon visits China in 1972. China moves pretty solidly into the U.S. camp in the mid 70s, right? Mao and Nixon meet. And especially then, the Gang of Four, right? They're calling the Soviet Union the main danger. So then, right? So then after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping comes to power, right? Ends the Cultural Revolution. So, 1978 is the year that China and Vietnam went to war. And what happened was it was about Cambodia. So in Cambodia, you had the Communist Party of Cambodia, which was a communist party. In Cambodia, there were two wings of the Communist Party. One was a Marxist-Leninist wing that was, pro-Soviet, pro-Vietnamese, whatever. It was just a normal communist party. Then there was this guy named Pol Pot. And Pol Pot was a wealthy Cambodian. He'd been a college student in France. And he was an ultra-left nut job. I mean, he was a Jacobin. He was an anarchist. He was actually more of an anarchist than anything, right? He said that Cambodia could build socialism on the basis of agrarianism. Like it didn't need to build socialism on the basis of industry. It didn't need to industrialize. It could go directly to communism. And so there was a fight in the Cambodian Communist Party between Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge and the mainstream Marxist-Leninists. And they started executing and killing the mainstream Marxist-Leninists. And a lot of people, and they evacuated the cities, and Pol Pot, they abolished money, they took all the money and confiscated all the money, and it was an ultra leftist regime, right? I mean, and they were trying to create this pure egalitarian utopia, I guess, and they were killing people, and it was awful, and they were opposed to technology, they were opposed to economic advancement. And they were covertly supported by the CIA. We didn't know that at the time. Nobody knew that at the time, but now it's public, right? That the United States was airdropping weapons and support. The United States, the U.S. intelligence, had propped up Pol Pot, and they had seen him as useful, right? Because he would fight the pro-Soviet wing of the Cambodian Communist Party, right? He takes power. He declares democratic Kampuchea, right? That's what he calls Cambodia. It's democratic Kampuchea. So China recognizes Pol Pot. The United States recognizes Pol Pot. Nobody else does. So there's some fights on the border, and eventually Vietnam invades Cambodia to protect the pro-Soviet communists of Cambodia who are being slaughtered against by Pol Pot. So Vietnam is there's a war between Vietnam and Cambodia. China is aligned with Cambodia, right? And China supports Pol Pot and says that Vietnam, that Soviet social imperialism, right? That Vietnam is a colony of the Soviet Union or whatever. So China invades Vietnam to protect Cambodia from the Soviet social imperialists. It was a disaster, and that's the thing. I mean, the people in the United States who will defend the Vietnam War will say things like, "Well, people say the Vietnam War was bad, but after the USA pulled out, all these communists started killing people. What do you think the boat people are, Caleb?" I've heard this my whole life. It's like, you think the USA killed a lot of people in Vietnam? Well, the communists killed way. No, the United States couldn't win in Vietnam with a military occupation, and couldn't win that way, right? The USA lost the Vietnam War that way. So then it went back to soft power strategy. The Carter administration in particular, that was Zbigniew Brzezinski. Jimmy Carter, said he was a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and that was his strategy, soft power, right? That was the idea, right? Was that they were going to manipulate communists against each other. And Henry Kissinger's thing was getting China to align with the United States against the Soviet Union. Zbigniew Brzezinski's thing was manipulating communists and figuring out. Zbigniew Brzezinski was like obsessed with communism. He was, this Cold War university guy. Yeah, Augie Hubbard. Why is it that in American academia there are very few Marxists? That's the funny thing, Augie. Don't you know that all college professors in the United States are Marxists? All of them, right? And that's why you shouldn't send your kid to university, because they'll all be brainwashed by communists. Don't you know that? Haven't you watched Fox News, Augie? I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, there are Marxists in the United States. I mean, how do I explain this? There are. Marxism is probably the most influential ideology in the 20th century, okay? The Soviet Union, China, the Cold War, World War II. I mean, it's like communism kind of made the 20th century, okay? So to have Marxism not have influence in academia would be ridiculous, right? I mean, you can't. Sociology, for example, right? In sociology, they give you, they don't really study Marx and Lenin. But there's, they talk about conflict theory, which is big among, they call it conflict theory, which is, okay, well, there's some people who think there's this thing called a class struggle, and they'll maybe quote some Gramsci. In political science, they have to talk about Marxism, right? I mean, it's like you can't talk about comparative politics, you can't talk about anthropology, sociology. Like, you have to acknowledge the Marxist point of view. It has had such a big impact. You can't, but in the United States, like, for example, at my college that I went to, I remember everyone thought it was just so liberal that anyone could ever, acknowledge Marx. It was like, oh my God, we read Marx. Oh, it was like, but like, for example, right? The State and Revolution by Lenin is probably one of the most important government administration texts ever written. I believe at one point, at least 2/3 of humanity lived under governments that were modeled on that book, right? That is the book, The State and Revolution by Lenin. That's the book on which the Soviet government was modeled. That's the book on which the Chinese government was modeled, the Cuban government, number of African governments, North Korea, a lot of Eastern European governments. So many governments have been based on the theory of the state that you find in that book by Lenin, The State and Revolution, right? Like, that book, it lays out the Marxist theory of government, right? Marx had hinted at it, sure, but Lenin was the first one to write a whole book on the question of the state. What do communist governments do? What do they look like? What is the purpose of a communist government? The State and Revolution by Lenin, right? And you read it. He talks about how the state arose, where it came from. He talks about the Paris Commune of 1871, its successes and its failures. He talks about how communists seize power. It's a very important text. The State and Revolution by Lenin is an extremely important text. Never will you see it assigned in college, right? And you'd think if people are studying political science, that's what was my major, political science, you would read it at some point. No, you never will read that. you'll get kind of a vague, like Marxists say the government is run by big business. Maybe there's truth there. Maybe you'll have a professor who will show you Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky that talks about how, big business influences the media and corporate censorship. But no, are you ever going to read The State and Revolution? No, because Lenin was a dictator who killed millions of people. Don't you know that? I mean, it's like it's like there's kind of like to describe academia as like they're all tankies, they're all Maoists or something. You would think that if you would read David Horowitz's website, if you look at that stuff. I mean, and there are. I mean, a lot of communists. Older, communists. That's what they did after the '60s was over. They got jobs in academia. Um, that's what they did. They worked in academia. They worked as college professors, and there's grant money. But then there's grant money for research, and a lot of the research that is done on different things. I mean, it happens, right? I mean, yeah. If you're in a red state, right? If you're in the South, if you're in the Midwest, the place that you will most likely, if you're going to find anybody who's at all familiar with Marxism, you're probably going to find a college professor. When I was in college, I had a lot of professors who were really kind of, they didn't even they had studied Marx academically, but they maybe they had been active when they were young, but they didn't even know that people were still doing the Marxism thing, and they were just kind of in awe of me, and I reminded them of their better days. It's kind of sweet in a way. But yeah, what else is on people's minds tonight? What else is new? What else is new, folks? Do you like any old folk music that was written by American leftists in the early 20th century? Interesting question, Rudy. Yeah, I mean, I like Woody Guthrie. But Joe Hill stuff. Is that really folk music? All right. So Max, I like the Joe Hill stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's like spoofs of popular songs. But yeah, thoughts on Earl Browder? Well, Earl Browder was the leader of the Communist Party USA in the '30s, right? Like when William Z. Foster had a heart attack during his 1932 presidential campaign, he went to the Soviet Union to recover his health, and Earl Browder became the leader. And Earl Browder, his reputation is like he was a scheming, corrupt politician. I mean, that's just how he was remembered. He was just kind of, crooked, ruthless, tyrannical. He's just kind of hated. Anyone who was in the Communist Party when he was in it saw him as just a bully, as corrupt, as kind of a sellout. And, I mean, he was a good writer. I mean, he knew he could write very well. He was very, very good at putting words together. And but yeah, especially during the Second World War, he dissolved the Communist Party. They became the Communist Political Association, and he wrote this book called Tehran: Our Path in War and Peace. That was, I mean, it was a repudiation of Marxism. He announced that there should never be strikes again. There should never be strikes because capitalism is no longer bad because it's anti-fascist. And I mean, Earl Browder, if you read this book he wrote, Tehran, which I have a copy of, Tehran: Our Path in War and Peace by Earl Browder. I have it actually on my bookshelf. And you read it, that book was a repudiation of Marxism. And William Z. Foster and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and the party actually overthrew Earl Browder. What happened was that a French communist wrote an article, Jacques Duclos. He wrote an article denouncing Earl Browder. Because, yeah, Earl Browder took advantage of the Second World War. Because in the Second World War, it was very important, obviously, for the communists to support the fight against fascism. And Earl Browder took advantage of that situation to take the Communist Party USA in a very, very right-wing direction. He dissolved the party. He changed it to the Communist Political Association. And the Communist Political Association didn't believe in Leninism. They believed in Marxist Jeffersonianism. What is your study method for remembering information from books and other sources? I don't have one. I will tell you this. In some ways, and this is a very weird thing to say. You stimulated me to say this, but it's a weird thing to say because it's not the kind of thing you would think you would say. But I enjoy learning, right? I've got a whole bunch of books here I'm going to talk to you about later in this live. I enjoy learning, and that's a curse in a lot of ways because it's hard for me to learn things I don't want to learn. You know what I'm saying? I mean, because I enjoy learning. People who don't enjoy learning, it's just like learning is a job, right? They study so they get their A on the test because they have to. They don't care. But for me, if you actually like to learn, the American educational system is not a good place for you. It's really not a good place for you if you really like to learn because, in the American educational system is about convincing you that learning is no fun, right? It's about convincing you that you shouldn't want to learn and that you should just kind of be obedient. It's about programming you, and for better or for worse. I mean, I'm not saying the way I am is better, but all this stuff I'm telling you about, I am interested in, right? I find it very interesting. Well, in a way, that doesn't help you in American academia and in other countries too, right? I mean, this is just, if you actually want to learn, then you're not programmable, um, right? The American educational system is a joke. Rockefellers. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, speaking of that, I did bring some books to talk to you about tonight. I actually wanted to bring this book. It's called Red Chicago by Randy Stork. Um, and this book is important now. It's important because, you know, right now, unemployment in the United States is rapidly on the rise. Many people are unemployed because of the pandemic. And in the early years of the 1930s, and this is Red Chicago, American Communism at its Grassroots by Randy Stork. And it's an empirical study by this academic of the Communist Party USA in Chicago from 1928 to 1935. And she goes through the membership rolls, she calculates what they did, what they didn't do. On the cover, you'll see this is an unemployed demonstration, and they're all there in suits and hats, right? And the signs say free milk, shoes, clothing for the unemployed, right? I mean, and this is what the communists did. They organized unemployed people and they fed them, right? And this is all about the Communist Party USA in Chicago in the 1930s, and it's really good. I read it during the financial crisis of 2008, and I think, that's when it was published. It was published in 2007. I read it in like 2008, 2009. It's a very, very good book, and it talks about what the communists did, during that period in the big industrial city of Chicago. And let's not forget that, the Communist Party USA, one of their positions in the 1932 election was to change the capital of the United States to Chicago, right? Because they said that Washington, D.C. was associated with the South and the slave plantation system, and that Chicago was in the heartland and it was an industrial city. And that was one of their platforms, was they would make Chicago the capital of the United States. And interestingly, the headquarters of the Communist Party was in Chicago during those years. And that was the case. And Earl Browder moved the headquarters of the Communist Party back to New York City, because he felt New York City was more international. Dust James is talking about professors who were in favor of the bombing of Libya. Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience. I mean, it was just, critique of U.S. foreign policy is like you're speaking a foreign language academia. Every class I would take, they would just give you the standard New York Times, Wall Street Journal line about every country in the world, and if you spoke against it, they would look at you like blankly, because you don't get grant money if you talk that way. You don't get tenure if you talk that way. Professors are people that have learned not to talk that way, right? That's how they've risen up in academia, is by not talking that way. I know so many people that are like left-wing academics, and like they're they teach classes, they live kind of a normal life, but like their crowning achievement is that they've written a book about some obscure anarchist in Spain or some obscure figure in the Communist Party USA in the 19 teens, and they publish a book that gets very little circulation, but they spend a decade writing it. It's weird. A lot of my family members always said to me, "Oh, you're going to love college. College is going to be so amazing, Caleb. You're going to love college so much." Well, I didn't. I mean, I wasn't happy with it. I feel like those people aren't really happy either. When I meet professors that are like, they have students, they have classes, and one thing I remember about college, well, why are we talking about this? I don't know. One thing I remember about college is that the professors I had that were left wing or whatever were terrified. All right, there was this whole thing of, David Horowitz, and they were so scared someone was going to record them saying something and they were going to lose their job, and they were just terrified. Meanwhile, conservative professors had no fear whatsoever. I had a professor who said, "My goal in this class is to get you to think more like a libertarian." I took a class called Gender and the Law, I remember. And it was all about how like feminism had hurt the family unit. And I mean, it was like Phyllis Schlafly kind of stuff. I dropped it. But it was just, there was a lot of stuff a lot of stuff that I mean, it was just. I mean, I didn't go to the best college, honestly, but yeah, this idea that academia, they're all just far left, and academia, they're all communists and all of that. Yeah, they might be slightly more left wing than most people, but no, they're not revolutionaries. And foreign policy, give me a break. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculously awful. Yeah, what else is new? What else is on people's minds? I can show you some other books here while we're at it. All right. Uh, all right. Someone's asking me about Trotskyism in Sri Lanka. I know nothing about that. I hope that's a joke question. It may not be, though. I just don't know anything about it. Um, you know, I guess I will talk about the thing I was planning to talk about before we got all sidetracked with whatever. Okay, so the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller family. And I see Kenneth asking me about socialist theater, and I'm actually going to talk about some socialist theater a little bit later here. I have something to share about that. But um, I have to go, Caleb. Keep up the great work. Thanks, David. I appreciate it. But yeah, the Rockefeller family. They are like one of the most powerful families in the United States. They were historically. And you want to talk about oligarchs and people with an exponential amount of power, that's the Rockefellers, right? And the Rockefeller family, if you want to talk about power and influence, so John D. Rockefeller, he created Standard Oil, right? And then in 1872, there was what they called the Cleveland Massacre or the Cleveland Conquest, where he, took control of 22 of the 26 corporations in Cleveland for oil. And he was important. He's not only was he controlling oil, but he was controlling the railroads, right? Oil had to be transported on railroads back then. About controlling the railroads. And it's like they're an oil monopoly family. They're ultra rich. They talk about the first billionaires in the world. John D. Rockefeller is the founder of it. Now John D. Rockefeller Jr., his son inherits the franchise. There's the famous Ludlow Massacre, right? 1914. There's a group of miners in Colorado that are out on strike. Of course, the company, the Rockefeller Company owns their homes, so they're evicted from their homes because they went on strike. They're living in tents, and then the police, the hired guns or whatever, open fire into the tents and kill 21 people. It's 1914, and afterwards, it's a bit of a public relations problem for Rockefeller because he's widely condemned because these striking miners are murdered. So because of that, he does like a PR stunt, and he goes and starts dancing with his workers, and they take pictures of him like square dancing with his workers. But that was John D. Jr. who did that. But then Nelson Rockefeller, the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, right? He was governor of New York for a long time. He's the guy who ordered the massacre at Attica State Prison, Attica State Penitentiary. You had the prison uprising, 1971. The prisoners, seized control of the prison. He's the guy who sent in the military to just kill people, right? 43 people killed, the Attica prison massacre. Right? The Rockefeller drug laws, right? People talk about the war on drugs. People talk about the prison industrial complex. Well, Nelson Rockefeller in 1973, New York State becomes kind of the pioneer of the Rockefeller drug laws. But the Rockefeller family, they're also the people that really created Planned Parenthood, right? Margaret Sanger, who opened the first birth control clinic in the United States. She got support from the Rockefellers, which was originally called the Birth Control League. And, John D. Rockefeller was a Malthusianism, was a Malthusian, I'm sorry, was a Malthusian. He believed there were too many people in the world, and it was bad for the economy, and he was all for Planned Parenthood. The sexual revolution, right? The Rockefellers paid for the Kinsey Report. I don't know if people know about the Kinsey Report. It was in the 1950s. This guy named Alfred Kinsey was a sex researcher from Indiana. He did all kinds of research and published the Kinsey Report, which was this book that argued that things like homosexuality were a lot more common. And a lot of Kinsey's research. I don't know about Olaf Palme. I don't know about that. A lot of Kinsey's research people said the sample study was not accurate. It was college students and prisoners. He actually employed a pedophile And there was a pedophile who was a child molester, and he actually used him in the research. And there were a lot of things about Alfred Kinsey that were quite unethical, to say the least. He was quite an unethical fellow, but he's the guy whose scientific research laid the basis for the sexual revolution. Modern art. I mean, the Rockefeller family were very, very key in modern art. So much that that they call the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the Rockefeller family, they call it Mom's Museum. Um, right? Henry Kissinger, right, who was the foreign policy strategist, was the guy who basically engineered Nixon's trip to China, China aligning with the United States against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Henry Kissinger, Rockefeller guy, had been working for the Rockefeller think tanks for years. Milton Friedman, the father of free market, Chicago school economics, right? Um, that fellow, he was definitely a Rockefeller creation. Rockefeller think tanks paid for the Chicago school and all that research. Um, the United Nations land, interestingly, it's the land of the United Nations. The actual soil that the UN is on in Manhattan was donated by the Rockefellers. All right, interesting fact. Riverside Church, which is a huge institution in New York City, it's a big, big church in Harlem that was very important in the civil rights movement and such. Paid for by the Rockefellers. Big, big statue of the Rockefellers in there. The Rockefellers were behind the Trilateral Commission, um, and that was kind of a think tank established, in the '60s and '70s, and it was the Carter administration. I mean, basically a lot of their policies came out of there, and the Trilateral Commission. Noam Chomsky has written a lot about the Trilateral Commission. And the thing about the Rockefellers is they were Republicans. They were Republicans, but they did not like the John Birch Society. Right? They were neocons. They didn't like the hard right, the paleoconservatives. And if you look at the administration, at the role of the Rockefellers in like the 1960s to the 70s, you can kind of see some important changes in American politics. One book I would recommend on this is called Market Elections, and it's by Vince Copeland. It's a very good resource. It's like a series of articles, so it's not written exactly the best way. It's not like one coherent narrative, but it's a good book, and it focuses a lot on the Rockefellers and their role in American politics. And in 1964, the Rockefellers were Republicans, and they were in New York State, but they were hated in the Republican Party by the hard right. The John Birch Society, the far right-wing Republicans called the Rockefellers communists because they had supported Planned Parenthood and because they'd supported Kinsey, and they insisted they were communists and they were globalists, and it was like kind of a lot of the Alex Jones stuff we hear now. In the Republican Party, the Rockefellers were hated. And in 1964, the Republican nominee for president was Barry Goldwater. And the Rockefellers didn't like Barry Goldwater. And they very underhandedly worked to defeat Barry Goldwater and get Lyndon Johnson elected. Right? They were very key in making sure that Lyndon Johnson was elected, was reelected, and that Barry Goldwater, this hard right conservative, didn't win. And they played up the idea that Goldwater was a fascist. They played up the idea that Goldwater would take us to nuclear war. And I mean, there's a lot to those allegations. Goldwater was a right-wing extremist, but the Rockefellers, despite being Republicans, were key in defeating Barry Goldwater. In 1968, again, they're Republicans in 1968, but again, the Rockefellers worked to defeat Richard Nixon. Even though Nixon wins, they didn't like Nixon. Right? Nixon won. They were not friendly to Richard Nixon. The Rockefellers did not favor Richard Nixon. And they support the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And Gerald Ford, who replaces Nixon, is very much in with the Rockefellers. They like Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford, of course, brings Alan Greenspan, who the Rockefellers like, a free market guy, into the White House with Ayn Rand. And Gerald Ford also brings in Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney into his administration. The Gerald Ford administration, the impeachment of Nixon was very much the Rockefellers kind of pushing Nixon out. They didn't like him. He was a Bonapartist. He was seen as a Bonapartist, as a strong man. 1980, Ronald Reagan, the Rockefellers never liked Ronald Reagan. They really did not like Ronald Reagan, but they forced him to accept George Herbert Walker Bush as his vice president. And that was kind of a turning point. Bush was from a rival wing of the Republican Party. He called Reagan a voodoo voodoo economics, right? And Bush was head of the CIA. Reagan was very much for the military-industrial complex, but it was a way of controlling Reagan. It's very fascinating. And that in U.S. politics, there's kind of a liberal establishment. You know, you talk about the Ford Foundation, you talk about the Rockefeller think tanks like the Asia Society, the National Endowment for Democracy, Soros. All of this kind of constitutes an axis. It's very powerful in U.S. politics, which, you know, is sometimes Republican and sometimes Democrat, and right now is Democrats. Right? It hasn't always been though. I mean, for most of my lifetime, it's been in both parties. But more recently, we've seen a polarization where the Rockefeller wing, the Eastern establishment, they're pretty much in the Democratic camp. They were with Obama. They don't like Trump. Silicon Valley is a creation of this wing. It was the CIA, it was Rockefeller think tanks and others that had the strategy to have government funding for computer technology. I mean, the USA saw that it had more money to invest in computers than the USSR. And even though the market wasn't rewarding it, you can read articles about how Google was created with loans from the NSA and the CIA, how IBM and Apple and all these countries, I mean, if it wasn't for the CIA, there would be no Microsoft, there would be no Apple, there would be no Facebook. I mean, it was the intelligence agencies really pushed the technology revolution because they saw it as a means to defeat the Soviet Union. And they saw the market wasn't going to naturally create it. They had the kind of the foresight. And it was the wing of the intelligence agencies that operates in Southern California that kind of had that foresight. And there's a lot that's been exposed about this, about the CIA's role in creating the computer revolution. So Jeff Bezos comes out of that, Amazon, right? And that Silicon Valley, the Eastern establishment, they're the two wings of American politics that are probably the most powerful, but they're a minority among the rich, right? I talk about the rich versus the ultra rich, and that's actually there's a good book by that title. But I'll also recommend, if you want to talk about the Rockefellers, this is a book called America's 60 Families by Ferdinand Lundberg. It's very, very good. It gets into the whole who is the ruling class. Very, very good. I'll also recommend Rockefeller Syndrome by Ferdinand Lundberg, a very, very good book. I would recommend. You want to get into who's the ruling class, and it's like the liberals, the liberal establishment, the folks that Trump doesn't like, right? The Rockefeller Syndrome. That's that wing, that Rockefeller establishment, right? It's the ultra rich, and it's a faction. It's a faction, and they generally, a lot of what they do is find academics, find strategists, and promote them, like Henry Kissinger, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, like Milton Friedman, and they find they've set up this apparatus, academia. We're just talking about academia. Well, if you want to understand academia, you should understand the Rockefellers. You should understand the Eastern establishment. This is the wing of the ruling class that is anti-Trump. I think that's what needs to be said. And Silicon Valley comes out of this, but the majority of the American capitalists are not part of this milieu, right? The military-industrial complex is a huge part of the U.S. economy. These folks often have the role of, trying to force the military-industrial complex to be more strategic. There's a lot of just consumerism. These folks are often pushing things like healthy food and such. And, this is the more managerial wing of the bourgeoisie, right? I talk about the ruling class. This is the more managerial wing of the ruling class. The wing that is, they're not so much, they are concerned about their short-term profits, but they're thinking long-term. They're thinking about controlling human beings. They see human beings almost, it's funny that Animal Farm, right? That's the George Orwell book that is anti-communist. But it's funny because it's like, you look at the managerial bourgeoisie, their relationship with people is much more a relationship of like a farmer to livestock. They see the human race as livestock. They want us to be productive. They want to raise us. They want to control us. It's much less. They're not thinking about their short-term profits. They're thinking about the human race as their livestock almost. I think that's what that particular wing of the ruling class is like. But yeah, folks, I got a couple more things we can talk about before I go. But anything else on your mind? I mean, you want to super chat me or chat me? Whatever. It's been a weird night. Credibility of CIA or mafia assassinating JFK. Well, we don't know. I mean, we really don't know. There's a lot of things. It's kind of like 9/11. There's a lot of things about the official story that don't add up, right? JFK, was assassinated. I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald, his life story, that doesn't make any sense. There's things about the parade route being changed. How would he have known? Was he just at work? Um, I don't know about Alexander Wendt and constructivist IR. I don't know about that, Huey. Sorry. But yeah, there's a lot of things about the Kennedy assassination that don't make sense. But, do we have proof? No. I mean, there's a lot of things that don't make sense. That's all we know. And that's what we can say about 9/11 too. There's a lot of things that don't make sense, but we can't, when you start saying, well, it was actually so-and-so who did, and, no, you can't do that, right? You can't do that. Um, you can't do that. I think that it seems like there was a division, a very, very big division between the Kennedy administration that was in with the Rockefellers and the Eastern establishment, that was pro-civil rights, that wanted soft power against communists, versus the military-industrial complex that was anti-civil rights, that wanted a confrontation, a big war to make lots of profits. There was a division within the bourgeoisie that was very, very big. Kennedy was hated. He was called a Soviet agent. He was called a communist, a traitor. And the place that he was killed, Dallas, was a stronghold of the military. I mean, that was a military city. I mean, I don't know if there's people watching from Texas, but Dallas is very much, folks, I never did the roll call. I never did the roll call. Can you believe that? I never did the roll call. I can't believe that slipped my mind. It's been a weird night. I'm just kind of sitting here in front of my window. I never did the roll call. I can't believe I never did the roll call. Folks, I'm so sorry. Names and locations. Names and locations. Give me your names and locations. Names and locations, folks. I'll call you out as I see you. I'm so sorry I forgot to do the roll call. Someone says he's from Dallas. It's true. Oh, there you go. Max Henson is in Boston. Huey Long is in New Orleans. Shoreline is in Connecticut. Owen. SoCal, right? Steve from Alberta, Kansas City, Missouri, San Diego. What was your worst experience with Trotskyism? And you said you would be debating Vosh. It went by too fast. Dante from SoCal, Long Island, New York, Mike in Phoenix, Brisbane, Australia, Western New York, Noah Buddy from Virginia, Bauxite from the Philippines, Kalamazoo, Michigan, Portland here, Azores Islands, right? Dead Pear, Wisconsin, New London, Connecticut, Ben in Toronto, North County, New York, Charlotte, North Carolina, Jack Dundee, San Diego, Leipzig, Joanne in Amsterdam, Cleveland. Hey from the Philippines, says Paz del Mundo, NYC, Peter from Queens, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Fresno, California, says American Futurist. Ron from St. George, wishing he was in Vietnam. Dimitri from Noel and from Philly. Great. Glad you guys are with us. Seattle, Washington. Hi, Caleb, says Alex Giovanni from Salem, Oregon. Leipzig, East Germany. John from Florida. Cheers from Northern Michigan, says A. Clark. Wow. What a crowd. Anyone else? Before, let me call you out as I see you. Wow. Auckland, New Zealand. Reno, Nevada. David from Italy. Pomona, California, says Mo Manon. Who else is with us? California. Space Communist from Corona, California. Wow. What a crowd. Daniel from Iran. Glasgow, Scotland. Toronto, Canada. Cascadia, Pacific Northwest. Tennessee, Dust James. It was a great interview I did with Just James. People should watch the interview. Copenhagen. Nate from Sydney, Australia. Hi from Reno. Newton Grove, North Carolina. Donnie Wallace. Okay. Anybody else? Pacific Northwest, Iron Sky. Welcome. Yes, there was a super chat about Olof Palme, but I'm not familiar with Olof Palme. But there was a super chat. What was my worst experience with Trotskyism? If someone wants to repeat it, I will answer the rest of it. Something about a debate with Vosh. What is your worst experience with Trotskyism? When will that be? Can't wait for you to stomp him. Love from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Okay. All right. So, folks, first of all, the debate with Vosh. So Vosh messaged me that he is actually willing to have a debate. So I said, great. We picked a moderator. He actually picked a moderator, but I looked into him. I had some other people look into him. He seems like a decent guy. And so, yeah, now we're just waiting for Vosh to agree on a time. So when Vosh agrees on a time, yeah. There we go. I'm preparing for it. People have sent me about his other work and what he might do and whatever. I'm preparing for it. I mean, he's not the most likable person in the world, but I will just try to handle myself properly. People have warned me that expect him to go through every tweet and everything I've ever said, and be prepared to try and go, gotcha. 20 years ago you tweeted out, aha. Be prepared for that. That's his style. Also, it's really important that we have this moderator, right? Really important that we have this moderator. Because if I mean, he talks. That's what he does. When he starts losing an argument, he just starts interrupting and yelling and speaking very fast, and he gets nervous. He gets nervous. He's not that well read. I mean, he's not that theoretical. But I don't expect. I expect. By the way, whenever I debate any of these big shots on the internet, I inevitably get a bunch of people who think, oh, he did amazing, and his fan bots are going to think he did amazing no matter what, right? But I'm hoping that I can make a good impression on a few people. But no matter how well I do, his fan bots are going to think, oh, he got you, you're stupid. I mean, it's kind of sad. The cult of personality. People just blindly, it's like they like Vosh and whatever. I'm preparing for getting spam and hate from a lot of Vosh people, and I'll survive. Stan Lin says, what's a Vosh? Exactly. And I lower my expectations with these debates. We have a moderator who will actually moderate, so that's good. And I'll argue with him, and we'll go back and forth. I mean, and we'll see. I mean, I'm pressing for a time limit of 1 hour, so it doesn't go on forever. It can just be kind of an exchange. He can say his views, I can give my views. We can answer each other. Opening statements, back and forth, closing statements. We're done. And it'll be worth doing. I think it's worth doing. And I feel like Vosh's experience with actual tankies is very limited. And that's the basis of his. I'm going to give him the benefit of assuming ignorance. I assume when he says that the tankies are like Nazis, he just doesn't know what he's talking about, right? He just doesn't know what he's talking about, right? It sounds like something you'd learn in history class. Everyone knows fascism and communism are the same because they oppose American freedom, right? He's just ignorant. So, we'll see how it goes. If he wants to get nasty, I can get nasty. I mean, there's plenty to make fun of there. I mean, I'm sorry. Have you ever watched this guy? But I don't like that. I'll just say it. I don't like that. That debate I did the other day where it turned into this like insult comedy fest. I don't like that. Right? I want to actually engage about ideas with people. I don't want to, but whatever. I mean, if he wants to get down and dirty and it gets ugly, whatever. And I don't care. You know what I mean? I've heard it all before. Trust me. I have heard it all before. I really have heard it all before. But yeah, so what was my worst experience with Trotskyism? Oh boy. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think worst experience with Trotskyism. Like, how do you put that in a category? Worst experience with Trotskyism. I don't know. I don't know. There was a time I went to go protest at the MTA, right, which is the Manhattan Transit Authority. I remember that there was something that went on in New York City, and on the subways. So it was like a whole bunch of leftists from different groups were going to the MTA to protest. I remember, I will not forget. Have you ever read Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean? I have not read Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean. I remember we went to the MTA board, and we're all getting up and criticizing the MTA. And this one guy gets up in front of the MTA board, I kid you not, in front of like a group of like bankers who run the New York City subway system. And he said, I would like now to read a statement. I am a transit worker, and I am also a revolutionary Trotskyist. And I just face palmed right there, like, oh shit, this isn't going to be good. And immediately starts reading this statement to the MTA board that is like off the wall, nuts, and they're just sitting there laughing at him. It's just like, and they're like, these freaks who come and protest us, it was just kind of embarrassing. I think I remember the statement, in addition to like whatever the MTA was doing, it was like the next thing he reads, it's like, it's like fake socialists like the ISO and Workers' World Party. It's just like, and he's like denouncing different communist groups to the MTA. And it was just painful. I was sitting there like cringing. It was just like, oh my God. But I felt that way I'll never forget. All right, there was an incident in New York City where some college students were facing some criminal charges, and they were in a communist group. And I had someone who was living with me at the time. It was like a roommate who was kind of an activist, but she wasn't a communist. And we both went to the rally to support them, the students. And it was this rally on a campus in New York City, and these students, thank goodness, the charges against them were dropped, but they were facing some criminal charges. And they were in a communist group, and so every communist group in New York City came to this rally and sent two or three people to this rally. And so we had this little rally. It's at the campus, and it's every communist group ever, and especially every communist group that's like represented on New York City campuses. And I kept looking at this person who was my roommate. I was so embarrassed for communists because I'm sitting there, and the amount of LARPing going on. I mean, this wasn't an activist rally. This was just communists, right? And the amount of like, we think we're so important going on was like pathetic. At one point, there was somebody from one of the communist groups on the campus, right? And they introduced him. Here is the chairman of the, Student Revolutionary Club of our college. And he gets up and he says, before I read my statement, and this is like a 20-year-old guy, before I read my statement, I must correct you. I am not the chairman of our Revolutionary Club. I am the general secretary of our, Revolutionary Club. And it's like, oh boy. Oh, okay. And then they're reading a statement, and every group on the campus, every little communist group that's represented on the college gets up. None of them can just speak, right? They all have to like, I am reading a statement on behalf of the Central Committee of the Revolutionary Formation of the Fifth Internationalist League and they're all reading it like, I am so badass. I am so fucking important. Oh, look at me. And I spent the last 3 nights arguing over every sentence in this. I mean, it's just like so like juvenile. So then after, the group, right, they read. Then another group is like reading a statement in support of them. So then a Trotskyist group gets up. While we support the students that are facing these criminal charges, while we support them, we do not support Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a bourgeois bootlicker, a Stalin. It's like, oh God. I mean, and it was just embarrassing. I mean, it was like nails on a chalkboard to be here. I mean, it was just like all of these, kids in their 20s. Nobody smiles at the rally. Everyone's just like, yeah, we're so cool. And they're all wearing berets, and it was just one big epic display of LARPing, and oh, it was gross, and it was Trotskyists and it was Maoists. It was Trots and Maoists mainly, right? And some anarchists. And it was just like toxic. It was just an atmosphere of adolescent egos and LARPing, and it was painful. I mean, thank goodness the charges against the students were dropped. That was good. I'm glad. I don't regret going to support them, but it was just stupid. It was like a rally of stupid, and it was every communist group showing its stupidest side, and they're all trying to one up each other and how badass they are, and they all. Oh, it was just embarrassing. So I guess that was probably my worst experience with Trotskyism, but it was also with Maoism. I mean, it was mainly with Maoism. Maoists and Trotskyists, campus leftists acting stupid. That was what that experience was. And it was painful. I mean, and it's just, the amount of like childishness. I mean, it's like kids dressing up in costumes pretending they're adults, or in this case, pretending that they're, revolutionaries from the 20th century. I mean, it was kind of pathetic. But yeah, that was probably my worst experience. But, the time where I was at the MTA board, and, this guy gets up and says I'm also a revolutionary Trotsky. It's just, I mean, yeah, thoughts on Ilan Pape. I don't know who Ilan Pape is. This is like, I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I just, you asked me about things. I wish I could give you more of an answer than that. I mean, but yeah. There you go. There you go. Right? But yeah, that was probably my worst experience with Trotskyism. But yeah, what else? We've talked about a few different things here. I wanted to talk to you, there's a play, and someone asked about socialist theater, Kenneth something. I hope he's still in the chat. Because there's a play that I accidentally read when I was like 11 years old. I accidentally read it. I found it. Thank you for the story, Caleb. It was worth it. Elmau, says Marco. Well, good. Okay. Um, you know, this is a play I came across in the public library. It was on the shelf, and I read it on a whim. I didn't know what it was going to be about, but plays they read really fast, and so yeah, Kenneth is here. You'll enjoy this, Kenneth. It's a socialist. It's a Marxist play. It was from the early '60s, and I came across it in the library. And I read it, and it was just in awe. It was like the most exciting thing I had ever read when I read it when I was 11 years old. Marat Sade. Marat Sade, right? It's the full title of the play. It's written by a German playwright named Peter Weiss. The persecution and assassination of John Paul Marat as performed by the inmates of the asylum at Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade. And it's Peter Weiss. It was a German playwright, and it was, obviously translated into English. And it was a hit on Broadway. It was a hit in European theaters. And it's, John Paul Marat was this journalist who was like a figure, who was like a leader of the French Revolution. He was like the agitator of the French Revolution, John Paul Marat, the revolutionary writer. And he was stabbed to death in his bathtub. And so the play is like a play within the play, right? That Marquis de Sade, who was the pornographic writer who wrote, very violent pornography, who was also part of the French Revolution, Marquis de Sade. And Marquis de Sade is in a mental hospital, and so he has the prisoners perform a play of the assassination of John Paul Marat. And I read this when I was like 11 years old. Ilan Pape was a Jewish professor who wrote extensively about Palestine and its ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. I recommend him to you. Well, thank you, Sami. I'll have to check him out. The play, it's like they're wrangling with the question of, was the French Revolution worth it? That's really what the play is about, right? And John Paul Marat is the unrepentant revolutionary who believes in the French Revolution. Marquis de Sade is a hedonist and a sex addict and a cruel person, and he doesn't think it was worth it. He thinks the French Revolution proved that human beings are naturally evil. And the two of them, debate throughout most of the play as the prisoners are performing the assassination. And it's very moving, right? Because it gives you the story of John Paul Marat, and it gives you, the viewpoint, the cynical, like libertarian, viewpoint of the Marquis de Sade. It's very good. It's a very good play. I recommend it. I know at one point, Judy Collins, the folk singer, actually recorded the songs from the play. And those are pretty good. You can look them up, the Marat Sade songs. But it's the question of, was the French Revolution really worth it? That's what it's about. John Paul Marat, the agitator, the journalist, thinks it was. Marquis de Sade thinks it was not. And it's about the aftermath of the French Revolution, what happened. I really recommend it. And I think that coming across that play accidentally in the public library and reading it kind of had a development on my impact, because it impacted my development, I guess, because it really it really forced me to engage with this question. I mean, it was fascinating. It's poor old Marat, in you we trust. You work till your eyes turn as red as rust. Marat, we're poor and the poor stay poor. Marat, don't make us wait anymore. We want our rights. We don't care how. We want the revolution now. I mean, it's pretty powerful stuff. Jacques Roux is mentioned in the play in a very ironic way too. I don't know who Jacques Roux is, so there you go. But yeah, it's a pretty powerful. It's about the question of revolution, and of course, like every work of art. I've reiterated, every work of art reflects the time period in which it was written, not the time period in which it takes place. And this is really about post-war Europe and communists in post-war Europe after World War II, after the Holocaust, after so much death, was the communist revolution and Marxism really worth it or not? That's really what Peter Weiss, the German playwright, is wrangling with. That's what he's really wrangling with. It's about Marxists and pro-Soviet, it's communists wondering if the Second World War does it. And honestly, who knows, right? It became a big hit, and, we know about the CIA's role in media, and it may be that American intelligence promoted this or something. I don't know that. I've never seen any evidence of that. But it's still a pretty good play. I mean, it wrangles with revolutionary questions. I recommend it. What do you think of Trump threatening to stop confiscate tankers from Iran destined for Venezuela? I think you know what I think about it, Joanne. It's BS. It's BS, right? I mean, Iran and Venezuela have the absolute right to cooperate economically. And the sanctions imposed, if the USA wants to impose sanctions on both of those countries and not trade with them, why can't they trade with each other, right? The USA has no right, in my view, to stop Iran and Venezuela from trading with each other. No right at all, right? The United States cuts off Iran, the United States cuts off Venezuela. They want to do business together. Why not, right? What right does the United States have there? The USA just tried to violently overthrow the Venezuelan government with a coup. Um, the USA, I mean, murdered the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani. The USA has violated the sovereignty of both countries. The USA, messes with both of their, I'm opposed to it. I'm opposed. And, tomorrow is the day of Al-Quds, which is the day where Muslims, it's the last Friday of Ramadan. It's the day when Muslims all over the world protest against Israel. And the reason for that is because Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Iranian Revolution, called for the last Friday of every Ramadan to be the day of Al-Quds. And I mean, if it weren't for the pandemic, there would be huge demonstrations all over the world against Israel tomorrow, right? And that's part of Iran's impact. Every year in New York City, there were huge demonstrations for the day of Al-Quds. Tomorrow is International Quds Day, right? The day of Al-Quds, the day of Jerusalem, and that's because of Khomeini. That's the Iranian Revolution that did that. And it was kind of, in the Iranian Revolution, in a lot of ways, I mean, it was seen as a victory for the Palestinians because it was a government coming to power that was definitely not an agent of the Western imperialists and was going to support the Palestinians. It's pretty wild. But yeah, the day of Al-Quds and the Palestine situation. But yeah, wow. What else is new, folks? It's been a wild, wild ride, wild evening. I'm just kind of, this isn't even like a prepared live. This is just kind of me like freewheeling. I talked to you about the Rockefellers a little bit. We did our thing. I showed you some books, but yeah, we're just kind of doing our thing here. So what else is new, folks? Anything new? What else is new? What else is on people's minds? Psalm M is thanking me for spreading my knowledge. Dust James says, long live the popular Islamic Revolution. Wow, 4 times and nothing. I don't know what 4 times and nothing means. Did you mention this other project? I'm writing this book on the synthetic left. Before that, I had this other project of a book I was working on that was kind of a summary of the last 10 years and fights within the ruling class. That's on hold right now. I'm finished the synthetic left book. I'm just kind of editing it. That's kind of, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Can you tell us about Maoists? Well, I mean, there's Maoists and there's Maoists, right? I mean, Mao is one of the most important figures in world history. There's many communists who draw great inspiration from Mao, have studied Mao's writings. But then there is Gang of Forests. There's like an ultra-left current. I sometimes call them ultra-Maoists. And that's an ultra-left deviation. But if you want to learn about Maoists, you should watch my lecture I gave, Mao and American Socialists. I edited it online with graphics. It was standing room only. People loved it. It was a great event. So Mao and American Socialists, that class I gave, that's what you should really check out. Stanley Stan Lin says Maoism versus Mao Zedong thought. Yeah, in China, they don't talk about Maoism. They have Marxist-Leninist ideology, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory. Right, so yeah, they don't talk about Maoism. Maoism is not a thing, But there you go. What else is new? I mean, the term Maoist had been kind of a slur for pro-Chinese communists for a long time. It wasn't, I think it was in the 80s. There was a document that was published, "Long Live Marxism, Leninism, Maoism," which was like a document on behalf of the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, which was this ultra-left grouping that the RCP USA was in, and the what do you call it? The RCP USA and the who else? The Shining Path of Peru and Naxals in India. They came out with this document, "Long Live Marxism, Leninism, Maoism," and that's kind of defined Maoism. Someone asked me about Eddie Bernays. I mean, he was the father of American public relations. He was a relative of Sigmund Freud. He popularized cigarettes, women smoking cigarettes, actually, because for a long time smoking was considered to be a man thing. But Eddie Bernays, right, he had the great idea that for a certain, it was like there was going to be a big parade in New York City. I forget which parade it was. He would pay a whole bunch of fashion models to smoke cigarettes, women fashion models to smoke cigarettes at the parade. Um, and he's kind of responsible for the notion that cigarettes are sexy, and that women should smoke cigarettes, right? He did a lot of like public relations stuff like that. Soviet taxis, says Comrade Freaky. I have no idea what Soviet taxis are. I mean, did they have taxis in the Soviet Union? I'm sure they did, or I mean, whatever. I mean, people have told me they didn't have cars in the Soviet Union. I would beg to differ with that, but I mean, nothing ever happens under communism, Caleb. Didn't you know that? But yeah, yeah, Maoism wasn't a thing until Mao was dead. Right. Right. I mean, it was Mao Zedong thought is what they called it in China. And then in the 80s, you had people calling themselves Maoists. But yeah, Eddie Bernays was a very important figure, the father of public relations, right? And he did a lot of weird stuff, like have women like break an egg when they cooked something. I forget what it was. I mean, they bake a cake, like cake mix, you break an egg. The British government has refused to give Venezuela their gold to be used during the COVID-19 crisis. Yeah, exactly. So much money has been stolen from Venezuela. The bank accounts have been frozen. I mean, they make it, I mean, no wonder Venezuela has problems. I mean, all their money in international banks has been frozen and stolen, you know? I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. Juan Guaido, I mean, this clown, this opposition figure, they claim he's the real representative of Venezuela, even though the population clearly doesn't support him. So much has been stolen from Venezuela. Um, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable what's going on, and Venezuela is suffering, but they're enduring, and they've got Cuban doctors there, and they've apparently done a pretty good job dealing with the pandemic, despite everything that went on. Iran had some very serious hardship. I read you that article earlier this week about Kerala and Vietnam and how they've been handling it. And the socialist countries have been doing very well in handling this. Yeah, China has shown great solidarity with Venezuela, says Tommy Farras. That is absolutely the truth. Absolutely the truth. But yeah, this has been a weird live, folks. But yeah, I'm probably going to wind it down here since I'm tired. But if there's anything else you want me to talk about, speak now or forever hold your peace. I'll probably be back again over the weekend at some point, Saturday or Sunday. But what is on people's minds? Anything else? Anything else before I wrap this up? Anything else? Anything at all? Anything at all? What are your thoughts on Libya after Gaddafi? Well, it's been a disaster, right? I mean, look at post-Gaddafi Libya. I mean, it's like the country's divided. People are trying to get out and drowning, and it's awful. Yeah, yeah. Very heroic Venezuelan fishermen, says Dust James. Well, Dust James is absolutely right about that. Look at them. They stopped a coup. The Bay of Pigs #2 failed. Yeah. International travel plans after the quarantine. I don't even know. I don't know. No idea. We'll see. You know. I mean, who knows when this is all going to be lifted? What do you make of the term Nazwol? And people started saying it a lot lately. I don't know. I mean, I've asked people what it means, right? And I mean, there was a party in Russia called the National Bolshevik Party, but now people have it to mean something different, right? And someone said, well, that's like a Nazi who pretends to be a communist to recruit people. Is one interpretation I heard. Other people said, well, it's tankies or it's racist communists or it's just a slur. I mean, it has no real meaning. There was a political party in Russia called the National Bolshevik Party. It was outlawed, and a lot of the people that were associated with it broke with it. That's that. That's all there is to it. I mean, so. Very few people were members of a political party in Russia. I think it was in the 90s that it existed, right? And it was an attempt it was like a more nationalistic version of the Communist Party, right? That's my understanding. And it traced its heritage back to a faction in the German Communist Party that argued that the Communist Party of Germany should appeal to more nationalistic sentiments. I think that's what it's rooted in. But yeah. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore, and it's just a slur. I mean, I did a video, I did a live, and then a friend of mine who runs the channel Flame of Liberation, he cut my live and put a video where I talked about Strasser, Nazbolism, and all of that stuff, and but it's like you can't. these people that make these, the people that talk about this, it's just that what they mean is you're not a liberal. You're not agreeing with U.S. foreign policy. You're not playing by our rules. And so we're gonna call you a name. It's just stupid. I mean, it's just whatever. Aren't you a Nazbol? What does that mean? What does that mean? You know, just a word somebody made up on the internet for, if it's like it's all these slurs. It's like cancel culture, personal assassination, character assassination. You know what I mean? It's just this. Oh, you are. It's just the internet is a cesspool. I mean, it's a place full of people who can be unpleasant to be around, if you know what I'm saying. But yeah, what else is new? Anything else, folks? Anything else, folks? Uh, where were you when the OJ verdict was read? Well, I was in class in school. I was like a first grader, and I know a lot of people, in the United States were like gathered in gyms and stuff. But they didn't do that at my little school in my little town. I know they did that. Well, never mind. But yeah, I wasn't. Yeah, I was whatever. And I didn't even really understand it. I was just a kid. I didn't really understand it. I heard about bloody gloves and I didn't know anything, so whatever. But yeah, it was a big deal. It was a very, very big deal, the OJ verdict. Yeah, I mean, that was a big case. And yeah, talk about the full and gong. Not a big fan. Not a big fan. Magical wheel in my stomach. Oh, the editor of North Star Compass magazine died. I didn't know that. Um, yeah, that was a magazine from Canada. I had a subscription at one point. It was kind of a pro-Stalin magazine from Canada. A lot of international articles. I didn't realize that the editor of that magazine had died. Oh, well, there you go. What time on Saturday? I'm hoping like afternoon, maybe evening time. But yeah, yeah, that's what I'm hoping. So, yeah, yeah. Where can I buy a copy of your book, Caleb? Lulu, Amazon, many online book dealers carry it. It's got distribution from Ingram, so anyone who works with Ingram, which is global. So, yeah, that's where you can buy a copy of the book. Good times. Good times, folks. Will you ever stream on midnight? Maybe. I've done that before, I think. I did like a really late night stream a long time ago. Um, but yeah. But yeah, tonight was a weird night, but hey, at least we got to do our roll call. Thanks for being here, folks. Do you think I should delete this stream afterwards, or do you think I should keep it? What do folks think? I'll read people's comments. Has this stream? I feel like this is like not whatever. Do you think I should delete this stream or leave it up? Hey, Charles said, just got your book, City Builders and Vandals. I'm enjoying it so far. Good, good. Sami says, keep it. Red Baron says, keep it. Kevin Q says, keep it. Tommy Farras says, keep it. All right. Some people rewatch it. Okay. I missed the beginning. Okay. Right. Keep it. Right. It's late here in the UK. Keep it. Right. Maybe call it casual. That's a good idea. I'll call it a casual stream. Yeah, because that's really what this is. This isn't like a performance, right? This just kind of turned into me sitting here answering super chats and talking. Hello, Caleb. You should keep it. All right. Everyone wants me to keep it. Casual Thursdays with Caleb. That's a good idea. Maybe we can just start doing that. Casual Thursdays, where I just kind of get on here and answer your questions. I don't do, because I actually edited the one on Monday. I made it like the opening presentation. I thought was particularly good. I had practiced it and stuff, and so I edited it and put it up with graphics. But yeah, maybe this can be call it casual and just repost your favorite bits. Says Kenneth. Oh, interesting. Well, that's an idea, but I'll probably leave it. Yeah, I'll leave it. Why not, right? Um, are you going to collab with Hakeem? I'd like to. I've seen his channel. He seems like a good guy. Right? Finnish Bolshevik. I'd collab with Finnish Bolshevik. I've seen that channel. Good channel. Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah. What else is new, folks? People want me to keep it, so I'll keep it. But yeah, that's a great idea. Call it casual. Whoever came up with that, great idea. I'll call it casual stream. Yes, do it. And I will. I will call it casual stream. Monday was epic, says Dust. Yeah, I thought Monday went particularly well. This is okay, though. You guys are a good crew. You're here, you're watching. I'm enjoying it with you. You're enjoying it with me. We're just kind of shooting the breeze. Corona streaming. We're all stuck at home. Whenever this damn pandemic ends, and I'm working regular hours and stuff, I'm not going to be able to do this as much. I'm trying to do it as much as I can now because why not? What else am I going to be doing? But But yeah, I don't think, I mean, when this pandemic ends, I think I'll be back to doing one per week, but maybe I can keep up the pace. I mean, this is good. I like doing it. We're building a little community here. We're really enjoying ourselves. We got the Discord app now, and maybe this debate with Vosh, and there is something in the works. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I got in contact with a rather notable individual. A rather notable individual, I'll say this, who's changed quite a bit. And that's all I'll say. I'm not going to say anything further about it. And I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with that, but we'll see. There's a rather notable individual who's really undergone some big dramatic changes, and I may be doing something with them. We'll see. We'll see. Not going to say who. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. But yeah, keep your head out for that. This debate with Vosh, let's see if this ever happens. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, he hasn't replied about what day it will be. And honestly, part of me is just kind of like, do I really want to? But I will. I will. I mean, I need to defend. When people say that tankies are the same as Nazis, somebody's got to call that out. And everyone he debates, I'm sorry. If I can have a fair, exchange with someone who's putting that out there and has such a big audience, it needs to be done. I feel like I have a responsibility to debate Vosh. Max Hassan says, destroy Bosch for us. Yeah, that's my responsibility. I mean, who else is going to do it? I mean, is Bob Avakian going to do it? I don't think so, right? Just join the stream. What's being discussed in regards to socialism in China's National People's Congress? I'll have to look into that. Maybe we'll talk about that on Saturday. I've been following different developments, um, so yeah, but hey, yeah, I'll be paying attention to that for sure. Um, I don't even know who Vosh is. What am I missing? So, oh, good, good, good. But yeah, uh, right. Be careful. Well, oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Um, but yeah, we're just kind of having a casual stream. I'm going to change this as soon as I finish this stream. I'm going to change it to be called a casual stream. Too bad I didn't have some like cool jazz music that we could play. Casual stream and like casual lounge. I shouldn't be wearing a casual. If it's casual, I shouldn't be wearing this tie, should I? Well, do you want me to take off the tie since this is a casual stream? I'll do it. I'll do it. Oh boy, what else is new, folks? You should convert Vosh's audience. Well, maybe that's a good idea. Is your pillowcase homemade? I don't think so. I don't think so. No, it's just old. It's an old pillowcase. It belonged to a relative of mine from a long time ago. Drop the tie. Yeah. All right. Can you go on an Unruhi Fallout stream? I don't play video games, so I don't think I can do that. Yeah. You should dress in a singlet vest and shorts. Wow. I'm not sure what a singlet vest is. I'm going to have to Google that afterwards, but I will Google it. Communists wear suits. Exactly, right? Professional politicians wear suits. Thoughts on Gorbachev? Not a big fan. Not a big fan. Um, what are your thoughts on proletarian internationalism? Right? I've said it again. There's no contradiction between patriotism and internationalism. Win-win cooperation, countries trading with each other on the basis of friendship, workers of the world unite, down with national chauvinism. Yeah, I mean, what more is there to say? Um, Dust James says, please stay classy. Thank you, Dust. Yeah, I want to stay classy. Um, yeah, very good. Oh, another thing is in the works. There's going to be some interesting stuff happening on this channel. All right, I'm taking a move again. I don't want to ruin these things. If I announce that I'm going to do something and then somehow it doesn't work out or whatever, I have to be careful. But I'm going to be taking a move to kind of take this channel to the next level. I'm going to be doing an experiment pretty soon, like a technical experiment. I'm going to be doing some videos that are not like other videos I've done. I'll be taking things to another technical level. And we'll see if it works. It may or may not work, but it'll be an experiment. It'll be an experiment. So keep your fingers crossed for that. I'm thinking probably next week, 2 weeks max, there will be some videos that are not like other videos on this channel you've seen. They'll be very, very different. And if you like them, and if it works, if it results in more subscribers and all that, I'll keep doing them that way. If not, I won't. It's just kind of an experiment, right? I'm experimenting with a new style. It's a new style that's not what you're expecting, but it's a new style that I'll be doing on the channel. Um, uh, so keep that in mind. Um, and yeah, keep your eyes out for that. That's all I can say about that. Keep your eyes out for it. It's a new style that I'm experimenting with. Should be next week or the week after that. Depends on how soon things can get finished. And it may not be what we want to do. I may need to do it another way, but I think it'll be okay. I think it'll work. Um, yeah. What else? What else is new? Okay, anything else, folks? Our casual stream continues. I'm going to take a drink of water. A drink of water. What else is new? You missed a super chat. Oh my God! What did someone send a super chat? What did I miss? What did I miss? What did I miss? I don't want to miss a super chat. What did I miss? What did I miss? I missed a super chat. Sukarno has the best quote ever. Destalinization. Khrushchev. Was that the super chat? Was destalinization and Khrushchev? Okay, all right. Well, yeah. After the death of Stalin, right? Khrushchev came in and gave the secret speech. 1956, 20th Party Congress in the Soviet Union. And at that speech, he accused Stalin of every crime under the sun. You know, after that, he launched de-Stalinization, which was an effort to try and liberalize the Soviet Union. They published anti-communist books. They published writers who were critical of the Soviet Union. And in the United States, that meant they started publishing, like in the Daily Worker, John Gates published stuff supporting the Hungarian counter-revolution in 1956 in the Daily Worker. John Gates was the editor of the Daily Worker, and he led this like Khrushchevist faction. And the Communist Party USA offered to merge with the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party turned them down. And yeah, it was just this big effort. And China went along with it. China published a document that was critical of Stalin called on the on the historical experience of dictatorship of the proletariat, which was critical of Stalin. In China, they had the 100 Flowers campaign. Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. And it was basically, yeah, the world communist movement was kind of doing a double take because Stalin had died, and then the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, announced just confirmed a lot of the worst things about Stalin that had been said. He confirmed them, and he said a lot of things that were not accurate, like that Stalin hid under his desk when he found out, Hitler had invaded and stuff like that. I mean, it was, in a lot of ways, the secret speech was basically Khrushchev groveling before the Western capitalists, saying he wanted to negotiate. He wanted détente. And afterwards, Khrushchev came up with this idea that, that capitalism and socialism would have a peaceful competition. They would just kind of leave each other alone. And socialism, it's very famous. You watch the kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Khrushchev, right? That was Khrushchev's idea, was they're going to have a debate. Right, or not a debate. They're going to leave each other alone. The USA will leave the Soviets alone. The Soviets will leave the US alone. And the Soviets will just prove that socialism is a more efficient mode of production. Right? Soviets can make more stuff than they're better at making stuff. It's a more efficient mode of production. The theory of peaceful competition between capitalism and socialism. That was Khrushchev's idea, and it doesn't work. Why? Because the capitalists won't leave the Soviet Union alone. They didn't leave it alone. They didn't leave the Cuban Revolution alone. They didn't leave the Soviets alone. But the Soviet, Khrushchev was hoping that he could, they call it détente. The idea that the Soviets and the United States would just have this agreement that they'll leave each other alone. The Soviets would call off third world revolutions. They would tell communists aligned with them around the world to stop having armed revolutions. And the Soviets would focus on producing material goods, and they would just do it better than the Western capitalists, and their economy would expand. And obviously, it didn't work. It didn't work. And that was Khrushchevism. I mean, and it was a disaster economically in the Soviet Union. It was a disaster internationally. It led to the fight with between the Soviet Union and China, and the Sino-Soviet Split. It was a disaster there. Yeah, Khrushchevism was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. And in a lot of ways it was inconsistent. I mean, Khrushchev, he did the Cuban Missile Crisis. He sends missiles to Cuba one day, the next day he's saying there should never be a violent revolution anywhere. Khrushchev was inconsistent. He was an inconsistent guy. Went back and forth, and eventually he was removed from power. And it was Kosygin and Brezhnev removed him in 1964 because he was such a disastrous leader. And Brezhnev was trying to move back into more of a Stalin direction, but it was a little bit too late, and things had there were problems in the Soviet Union, and those problems really became more intense in the 70s and 80s, but starting in the 60s, there were big problems, right? Yeah, I mean, Khrushchev was a disastrous leader, and they always say he was banging his shoe on the podium, saying he was going to blow up the United States. He was yelling about the Congo. He wasn't saying he was going to bury the United States. And even though "we will bury you," that was a mistranslation. It was "we will outlast you. We will create more material goods than you." That was not what he said. But there was a whole lot of, it was like, there was a huge faction of the Soviet Communist Party that never wanted any confrontation with the United States. You know, I mean, you know, but it was necessary. The military-industrial complex, the lower level capitalists in the United States, the weapons manufacturers of the USA, really wanted to play up the idea that Soviets were going to invade the United States, and so we had to fight them over there and not fight them over here, that kind of thing. And that's really who the hard right in the USA during the Cold War were. I mean, that was who the right wing in the United States were, the military industrial complex. The left wing were the soft power people, the Rockefellers, the CIA. And then I guess the hard right were like the lower level capitalists that were so low they weren't in military manufacturing. They were like libertarian kind of, right? And that's, people talk about like ranchers, right? Like the Bundy Ranch and people like that, right? Those folks are, yeah, they're like more Ron Paul-y kind of people, right? But it's like, you had, the John Birch Society, and then you had people that were, but most of the right wing in the United States, motorcycles. I told you motorcycles. I don't know if you can hear that on there. Loud motorcycle just went by. I only got the window cracked a little bit, but yeah, the right wing in the United States for the most part was the military-industrial complex, right? The soft power folks, the CIA, the Eastern establishment, that was the liberals, and then the hard right wing were like the lower level capitalists. Like the John Birch Society was against the Vietnam War. They thought the Vietnam War was a conspiracy to make communists look good or something. You can't, but those folks, like libertarian, like those folks were so outside of the mainstream in the United States that they were like, that was like, I believe the guy who funded the John Birch Society was a guy who invented the flat sucker, if I'm not mistaken. The flat sucker, and I think it's Welch's grape juice, if I'm not mistaken, like Welch's, like Robert Welch, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, there was some low-level capitalists that were so right-wing they were actually anti-war. But for the most part, most of the right wing, it was military-industrial complex, and that's actually, I'll tell you this, right? And I mean, this is a gem, right? I mean, everyone who sat through this casual live, the Workers' World Party, right? Sam Marcy, right? He was the leader of the Workers' World Party. And, you know, if you look at the role that his analysis, the analysis of Sam Marcy in his final years in the 80s, the 90s, even in the 70s, right? He writes a book called Generals Over the White House, which is about how the military-industrial complex was moving against Jimmy Carter, right? How the military-industrial complex did not like Jimmy Carter because he was more for soft power and CIA manipulation rather than direct confrontation with the USSR. He wanted to sign the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, and that if you read that stuff, Sam Marcy, it was like, and the Workers' World Party, they were running anti-war rallies, and in their minds, the military-industrial complex was the enemy, right? And I mean, as a Marxist, I can understand why they would think that, and I mean, they're not wrong. I mean, but really what they didn't understand was that the people who overthrew socialism in the Soviet Union and all over the world were not the military-industrial complex. The Soviet Union was overthrown by the soft power elements, the Soros, the Brzezinski, the Carter administration, the Rockefellers. Those are the people that really overthrew socialism in the Soviet Union. And the Workers' World Party talk to those older members, they will admit they didn't see it coming. The fall of the Soviet Union took them completely by surprise because their entire focus had been on opposing the military industrial complex, running peace rallies, opposing the military industrial complex, and they did not see the fall of the Soviet Union coming, number one. And even afterwards, you read their writing on the fall of the Soviet Union, they're not able to wrap their mind around the fact that that soft power Eastern establishment, right, Brzezinski, Soros, those kind of people, the kind of people that, were marching with them against nuclear weapons, those people had more to do with the overthrow of socialism than the military-industrial complex did, right? That the arms race, sure, that caused economic problems in the Soviet Union, but it also had a rally around the flag effect, right? It made the Soviet people more militarized. The USA's out to get it. It was that soft power manipulation, right? That courting of Soviet intellectuals, blue jeans and Beatles music, and it was that kind of intellectual infiltration of Soviet society. The belief, getting the Soviet population to believe that the USA was this magical land of freedom, right? That the USA was just a place where everyone just did modern art all day and smoked marijuana and played rock and roll music and drank Coca-Cola. And if you overthrow socialism, the Soviet Union will be just like the United States. It'll become, rock and roll, freedom, fun land. It was that kind of soft power manipulation of intellectuals. That's what overthrew socialism. And a lot of that was the new left, right? The hippies, right? The peace movement. That it was the synthetic left that overthrew socialism in the Soviet Union. It wasn't the hard right. The hard right did their part, okay? It was like a double team, right? It was like good cop, bad cop. Reagan, military escalation, calling the USSR an evil empire, but synthetic left, well, we want to talk, and we want. It was like a good cop, bad cop routine. The Democrats and the Republicans, Reagan, Carter, right? It was a good cop, bad cop routine. But ultimately, the arms race did not make Gorbachev and the Soviet Communist Party surrender, right? The Soviet Communist Party was infiltrated, and it was infiltrated, and there was a huge amount of manipulation and the synthetic left, these elements that are that claim to be progressive and anti-imperialist, those elements, the synthetic left, those elements, they had a lot more to do with the fall of the Soviet Union. They were the ones that got into the USSR, had the leaders of the USSR convinced the USA was their friend, would not cause them problems, undermined Marxist ideology, undermined socialist narratives covertly. It was that soft power apparatus, you know, and John Paul II and Solidarność, and I mean, you look at the color revolutions of Eastern Europe, right? It was that, the people that marched in Czechoslovakia against the Communist Party, and were mad about human rights and stuff, who had legitimate grievances, they weren't, the people working with them, were not Reaganites preaching anti-communism. The people who manipulated them and duped them into overthrowing socialism, they were liberals and they were leftists, right? And that it was the left wing of imperialism. It was that Rockefeller Eastern establishment that brought down socialism in the USSR. And Sam Marcy and the Workers' World Party and most of the communists in the Western world just couldn't wrap their minds around that, because that's where they had been embedding themselves. In their minds, the military-industrial complex was the biggest threat. That's what they believed. That's what communists throughout the late Cold War believed. They believed that it was the Republicans, the military-industrial complex were the main threat to the Soviet Union, the main threat to communism. And they were not correct, right? I mean, they were not correct. The forces that had the ability to destroy socialism, not the forces that had the ability to hurt socialism, attack socialist countries, the ones who really had the ability to destroy socialism were coming from the left wing of imperialism. And what they did by manipulating left-wing politics with the rise of Euro-communism, right? That was Brzezinski. That was the CIA. I mean, getting communist parties all throughout Europe to cut their ties with the Soviet Union, that was a very effective strategy for Brzezinski. And the synthetic left, right? The Rockefeller entity. I mean, this kind of stuff, that stuff is what won the Cold War for the United States. it's kind of like Obama, right? So far, Obama, I mean, Trump, I mean, he's okay. His first term's not over yet. I mean, he could probably do a lot more damage than Obama. But if you look at it, Obama did a lot more damage. They talk about Obama being the more effective evil, right? The strategic stuff. Imagine if Trump had been president during the Arab Spring. Do you think it would have ended up the way it did? Imagine Bush had been president during the Arab Spring. No, but you had to have the first black president of the United States with a Muslim name to make the Arab Spring work. The fact that the State Department and Obama and all of them were able to manipulate the Arab Spring the way they did, that really required a level of of intelligence, soft power, genius. Really, I mean, the Arab Spring. I mean, the outcome of the Arab Spring is disastrous. Egypt is no better off. Libya is no better off. Syria is no better off. I mean, nowhere did the Arab Spring, have good results. The Arab Spring was a disaster. But imagine if the USA had not been on top of it. Imagine that the soft power apparatus of the U.S. government had not been able to manipulate it the way it did. Things would have ended up very differently. But again, it's that liberal wing that it was the most deadly to socialism, and no one talks about that. Nobody talks about that. But yeah, it seems that capitalist forces in China are the most dangerous to the future of Chinese socialism. Maybe. Maybe. But yeah, this has been a casual stream. So yeah, I'll end it. I popularized the slogan, "We need a government of action to fight for working families." A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. And with that, I'm out. Talk to you later, folks.